The scribe worked by the light of a single oil lamp. Outside the temple, the sky had turned the color of old copper, and the air smelled of burning stone. He had 3 hours left, maybe less. The other scribes had already fled the city, taking with them only what they could carry, and most of what they carried would not survive what was coming. He knew this because the tablet beside him said so. He had read it twice that day. He had read it again. And then he had begun to copy it onto fresh clay, because the original was already cracked, and because the gods had told him that the knowledge of what came before could not be allowed to die with him. His name was Enmeduranki, or it was something close to that name, and the city around him was Shurupak, or it was a city that wore that name. The records that survived him would call him a priest, then a king, then a myth, and finally nothing at all. But on this night, in this room, he was only a man with shaking hands and a tablet that described 5 worlds before this one. 5 times the gods had built civilizations on this earth, and 5 times those civilizations had ended in fire or stone or wind or water or in a silence worse than any of those. Each one had risen higher than the one before it. Each one had been wiped from the earth by a different hand. And each ending had been described in detail, in the language the scribe was now copying onto clay he knew would outlast him by thousands of years. The first world had ended in light so bright the sky itself had cracked open. The second had ended when the ground beneath the cities decided it no longer wished to hold them. The third had been swept from the sky as if the air had grown tired of carrying them. The fourth had drowned in a flood that came from beneath the ocean and from above the clouds at the same time, which is not a thing that should be physically possible, and yet the tablet described it without hesitation. The 5th world was ending now, outside the temple. While the scribe wrote, "The cataclysm that ended the 5th world is the one that survived in human memory under 1,000 different names. The Greeks called it the deluge, the Hebrews called it the flood, the Maya called it the destruction by water. The Aztecs called it the 4th sun, because they had their own count, and their count was different, but the event was the same. Every culture remembered it. Every culture wrote it down. And every single one of those accounts," the tablet said, "was a corruption, a simplification, a child's version of what had really happened. What had really happened was on the tablet, in language the scribe was copying, word by word." While the sky outside turned the color of old copper and the air filled with the smell of burning stone, and the gods who had built 5 worlds and watched 5 worlds die prepared to do the same thing again to the world that was his. This is the story of that tablet. What it described, what it warned, and why the men who first translated it, in a stone building in London, 4,000 years after the scribe finished his copy, decided that some pieces of it should never be read aloud again. Before this channel goes any deeper into what that tablet actually contains, take a moment to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. The story of the 5 worlds has been told in fragments for 170 years, and the fragments have been scattered on purpose. Subscribing to this channel keeps the pieces coming to you, one full account at a time, before the algorithms decide that this kind of history should stop reaching the people who are ready to hear it. Tap subscribe, tap the bell, and then come back to the tablet, because what comes next has never been laid out in one place like this before. The tablet does not have a name. It has a catalog number, assigned to it in 1872 by the curators of the British Museum, who at the time had no idea what they were looking at. The number was K4131. The K stood for Kuyunjik, the mound in northern Iraq that had once been the city of Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire and home to the largest known library of the ancient world. The library belonged to King Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century before Christ, and who had collected in his palace every tablet his scribes could find or copy from every culture he had ever conquered. When his empire fell, his palace burned, and the burning baked the clay tablets in his library into permanence. They survived because they were destroyed, 25,000 of them. Pulled out of the ash by Austin Henry Layard and his assistants between 1849 and 1851, shipped to London in wooden crates, and stacked in the basements of the British Museum to be sorted, eventually, by men who would spend the rest of their lives trying to read them. K4131 was sorted in 1872. It was small, roughly the size of a man's hand, both sides covered in dense cuneiform writing. The clay was darker than the tablets around it, suggesting it had been baked longer, or hotter, or both. The wedge-shaped marks were clean. Whoever had made the tablet had been a master scribe. The translation began that summer and stopped before the year was out, because the scholar working on it, a man named George Smith, was already drowning in another project. Smith was the one who had just announced, to a stunned audience at a meeting of the Society of Biblical Archaeology, that he had found a Babylonian version of the flood story on a different tablet. The discovery had made him famous. It had also made him busy. K 4131 was set aside. It would be set aside for the next 63 years. When it was finally picked up again, in 1935, by a scholar whose name has been carefully removed from the museum's records for reasons that the official catalog still describes as administrative, the translation was completed in 11 days. 11 days, working alone, in a basement office, with the door closed. When the translation was finished, the scholar sent a copy to 3 colleagues. 2 of them never replied. The third one wrote back with a single sentence, which has been preserved in a letter that survived in a private archive and was published in a small academic journal in 1981. The sentence read, "Do not show this to anyone else until we have spoken in person." They never spoke in person. The scholar who had completed the translation died, of what the inquest described as natural causes, 6 weeks later. He was 41 years old. The translation was filed in the museum's restricted access room, where it remained until 1968, when a junior curator, in the process of cataloging materials for an upcoming exhibition, came across it again. The curator made a personal copy. He showed it to his thesis advisor. His thesis advisor showed it, in turn, to a small circle of scholars who specialized in the most obscure corners of Mesopotamian literature. And gradually, over the next 30 years, the contents of K 4131 began to leak. The leak was never complete. Pieces of the translation appeared in academic journals, always couched in language so cautious that the casual reader would never have noticed what was being described. References to it appeared in the footnotes of books that were otherwise about completely unrelated subjects. Once, in 1992, a section of the tablet was read aloud in its original Sumerian at a conference in Vienna, and the recording of that reading was scrubbed from the conference archives within 48 hours. The official explanation was that the audio quality had been deemed insufficient for inclusion. The unofficial explanation, given by a researcher who had been in the room, was that someone in the audience had recognized what was being read and had made a phone call, and the phone call had ended with the recording being destroyed. What the tablet describes is this. Before our world existed, there were 5 other worlds, 5 other ages of civilization on this earth. Each one was constructed by the Anunnaki, the gods who had come from the heavens to oversee the development of life on this planet. Each one was populated by a different kind of being. Each one rose to a height of culture and knowledge that our current civilization has not yet matched, in some cases not even approached. And each one was destroyed, deliberately, by the same hands that had built it. The reasons for the destruction differ from world to world. The methods differ too. But the pattern is the same. A world is built. A world is allowed to grow. A world is observed and judged, and at some point a decision is made, and the world is ended. Some of the previous worlds left survivors. Some did not. The survivors of one world, when they survived, became the foundation for the world that came next. This is why, the tablet says, the gods chose this planet. Not because it was beautiful, not because it was empty, but because it could be cycled, used, reset, when the use had been exhausted. We are the 6th world. According to the tablet, we are also the last one the Anunnaki built before they left. The first world the tablet describes is called, in the original Sumerian, the Ud-la-lal. The translation that has come down through the scholarly footnotes renders this phrase as the bright days, or in some versions, the days of first light, but neither rendering carries the full weight of what the original syllables meant. Lal is a doubling word in Sumerian. It intensifies whatever it is attached to. So Ud-la-lal is not simply the bright days. It is the brightness within the brightness, the light at the heart of light, the world that existed before there was anything yet to cast a shadow. The tablet describes the Ud-la-lal as the first attempt at civilization on this planet, undertaken by the Anunnaki shortly after their arrival from the world, the Sumerians called Nibiru. The arrival itself is described elsewhere in the Mesopotamian corpus, and the details are familiar to anyone who has spent time with the Sitchin translations or the older work of Samuel Noah Kramer. What is not familiar, because it appears only on K 4131, is what the Anunnaki did first, before they began the work of mining and engineering and the eventual creation of human beings. What they did first was attempt to populate the earth with a race of their own design, a race that would not need to mine, or to labor, or to obey, because it would already be in a state of completion at the moment of its creation. The Ud-la-lal were that race. The tablet describes them as beings of light. The phrase is not metaphor. The Sumerian word used, melamu, has been mistranslated for over a century as radiance or splendor, or sometimes divine aura. The word actually refers to a quality of physical existence in which a being is composed of the same substance that radiates from the stars. The Ud-lal-lal were not flesh. They were not stone. They were what the Sumerian scribes, who had no other word for it, called crystallized fire. They could be seen, they could move, they could communicate. But if you had reached out to touch one of them, your hand would have passed through, and your hand would have come away changed, because contact with the Ud-lal-lal was contact with the raw light of creation, and raw light of creation does not leave the things it touches in the same condition it found them. They built cities. The tablet uses the word egal, which in later Sumerian came to mean palace or temple, but in this earliest layer of language seems to have meant something closer to a structure of organized light. The cities of the Ud-lal-lal were located, according to the tablet, in regions of the earth that no longer exist as land. They were built on the great continent that the Mesopotamian texts call Kurgal, the Great Mountain, which the modern reader can interpret variously as a polar landmass, an equatorial supercontinent, or something that has no analog in the geography we currently understand. What is consistent across the descriptions is that Kurgal was vast, that it stood higher than any continent that exists today, and that it was lit not by the sun, but by an internal radiance generated by the Ud-lal-lal themselves. The cities glowed. The land glowed. The sky above the land glowed back. The world of the first inhabitants was, in the most literal sense, a world without darkness. This is the detail the tablet returns to most often. There was no night in the Ud-lal-lal. There were no shadows. There was no need for fire, or for lamps, or for any of the structures human civilizations have built to keep darkness at bay, because darkness, as the tablet phrases it, had not yet been invented. The Ud-lal-lal had been created at a moment in the planet's history when the celestial conditions made constant illumination not only possible but inevitable. The Earth at this time, the tablet says, was closer to its sun. The atmosphere was thinner. The planet rotated more slowly. Whether these details reflect actual geological history, or whether they are descriptions of conditions on some other world entirely, is a question the scholars who first translated the tablet did not feel qualified to answer. What they did feel qualified to describe was the culture of the Ud-lal-lal. The beings of light, the tablet says, were not concerned with survival, because their existence was self-sustaining. They were not concerned with reproduction, because they did not die. They were not concerned with food or shelter or any of the necessities that drive the development of human culture. What they were concerned with was harmony. The tablet uses the Sumerian phrase mi-tab-ba, which can be translated as paired powers, or matching forces, or two voices that produce a third by their combination. The Ud-lal-lal communicated by this method. Each one of them, when it spoke, produced a sound that was incomplete by itself, and that found its completion only when another of their kind responded with the matching sound. To listen to two Ud-lal-lal in conversation, the tablet says, was to hear music being composed by accident, by the simple act of two beings acknowledging each other's presence. They built their cities according to the same principle. Each structure was incomplete. Each was designed to harmonize with a structure on the other side of the continent, or sometimes on the other side of the world. The full architecture of the Ud-lal-lal civilization could only be perceived from a vantage point that allowed the observer to take in the entire planet at once. The Anunnaki, who could achieve this vantage point from their craft, the tablet says, watched the slow construction of the first world with what the scribe describes as something like awe. Their creation was producing beauty they had not anticipated. The Ud-lal-lal were composing the planet itself into a kind of music. This was the first world, and this was the world that the Anunnaki, after a period of observation, decided to destroy. The tablet is careful about the reason. The Ud-lal-lal had done nothing wrong. They had not rebelled. They had not displeased their creators. The decision to end the first world was not punishment. It was correction. The Anunnaki had built a race that was, in their own assessment, too perfect. The Ud-lal-lal had no need of anything. They had no struggle. They had no purpose beyond the harmony of their own existence. And because they had no purpose, they could not be used. The Anunnaki, the tablet implies, had created beings that did not require gods. Beings that had achieved, at the moment of their creation, what every later civilization the Anunnaki built would spend its entire existence trying to reach. The Ud-lal-lal were finished. They were complete. And the Anunnaki, who had not yet realized what they wanted from the planet they were occupying, looked at the finished beings they had made and decided that finishing them had been the mistake. The ending of the first world was called, in the language of the tablet, the Izian, the fire from above. The phrase has been mistranslated repeatedly in the academic literature as solar flare or as comet impact or as some other natural disaster, but the original Sumerian carries no implication of a natural event. The Izian was directed. It was aimed. The tablet describes a craft, or a group of craft, that the Anunnaki positioned above the continent of Kurgal at a specific point in the planet's rotation. From these craft, a single beam of light was released. The beam struck the largest of the Udlalal cities first. The city did not burn, it did not collapse. It simply ceased to be illuminated, and in ceasing to be illuminated, it ceased to exist, because the city was made of light and could not exist without it. The other cities followed, one by one. Their internal radiance pulled out of them by the beam from above, like water draining from a vessel. The Udlalal themselves, the tablet says, did not understand what was happening. They had no word for ending because none of them had ever ended. They had no word for the experience of having their light withdrawn because nothing had ever drained them before. The tablet describes the last moments of the first world in language that is almost unbearable to read. The Udlalal continued their harmonic conversations even as the harmonics began to fall silent around them. Each one waited for the response that would complete its own sound. Each one waited longer than it had ever waited before. And each one, eventually, found itself producing a sound that no other voice would ever answer. Because the voice that would have answered had already been drained. And the voice after that, and the voice after that. The continent of Kurgal, no longer illuminated by the beings it had carried, no longer warm, no longer held in place by the harmonic structure of the cities, began to sink. The Sumerian word the tablet uses is sumun, which means to settle, but in this context appears to indicate a process of slow geological collapse. Kurgal sank over a period of what the tablet describes as one full revolution of the planet around its sun. By the end of that year, the great continent was gone. Beneath the water, forgotten, the world that had glowed without need of a sun was dark, and the planet, for the first time in its history, experienced the condition that the Udlalal had never had a word for: night. The Anunnaki, the tablet says, were satisfied. They had learned what they needed to learn. They had created a race of beings that did not need them, and they had ended that race, and they had taken from the ending the knowledge that what they wanted, what they had needed all along, was a race that would always need them. The second world would be built with this knowledge in mind. The second world would not be made of light. It would be made of something heavier. Something that could be commanded. The second world would labor, but the first world left something behind. The tablet is specific on this point. Not every Udlalal had been in the cities when the Izian struck. Some had been traveling, or had been at sea, or had been in the deep regions of the continent that the beam could not reach. These survivors, the tablet says, did not survive long. Without the harmonic structure of the cities to sustain them, they began to fade. But before they faded, they did one thing. They wrote, or rather, they engraved. Into the surface of the deepest stones they could find, into the underside of the cliffs that would later be eroded into the sea floor, into the bones of the planet itself, they left a record, not of themselves. They had no concept of self that could survive their own ending. What they left was the harmonic structure of their cities, the notes, the patterns, the mathematics of light that had held their world together. These engravings, the tablet says, are still there, beneath the water, on stones that have not been seen by living eyes in 100,000 years. The Anunnaki, in destroying the first world, had not destroyed the music. The music had been etched into the planet itself, and the planet was older than the gods, and the planet would carry the music until something thought to look for it. The tablet implies, in language that the translator of 1935 marked with a series of question marks in the margin, that the music can still be detected. That certain frequencies, recorded at certain depths, in certain locations, will produce a response from the stones. That if you listen long enough, in the right place, with the right instruments, the first world will still answer. The tablet names 3 of the Udlalal cities. The naming is unusual, because by the standards of later Sumerian literature, the cities of the first world should not have had names at all. Sumerian cities are typically named after their patron deity, and the Udlalal did not have deities, because the Anunnaki had not yet positioned themselves as gods to the beings they had created. They were observers. They were architects. They were not yet worshipped. And so the cities of the first world were named, the tablet says, by the Udlalal themselves, in a process the scribe describes as collective and harmonic, where the inhabitants of each city would compose, together, a single sustained sound that would become the name of the place they lived in. The first of the 3 named cities is called, in the closest phonetic approximation the cuneiform can render, A-N-Shu. The second is called Mul-Mul-An. The third is called simply Ki, which in later Sumerian would become the standard word for Earth itself. But in this earliest layer of meaning referred to a specific city, the largest of them, the seat of the Ud-Lalal as a unified civilization. Anshu seems to have been located, according to the directional language in the tablet, at the eastern edge of the continent. Mul-Mul-An, whose name translates as the place of many stars, sat at the highest elevation of Kurgal, on what the tablet calls the spine of the world. Ki was at the geographic center of the continent, on a plane that the tablet describes as flat in every direction for as far as the harmonic sense of the Ud-Lalal could reach. The translator of 1935, whose marginal notes survived in the personal copy that the junior curator made in 1968, returned several times to the section describing Ki. He underlined the name. He wrote, in pencil, the question, why this name? He wrote, in the margin of the next line, the word survives. And he wrote, 3 pages later, in handwriting that the curator later described as visibly shaking, the sentence, we kept their word for the planet. He did not elaborate in his notes. But the implication of the sentence is clear. The translator, by 1935, had recognized that the Sumerian word for earth, the word that survived into Akkadian and into every related Semitic language, and that ultimately seeded the geographical vocabulary of half the modern world, was originally the name of a city in the first world, a city of the Ud-Lalal. The civilization that the Anunnaki had erased had not been entirely erased after all. Its central city's name had survived, as the word for the planet itself, in the language of every culture that had ever named the ground beneath its feet. The translator's 3 colleagues, the ones who had received his initial copy, would not have missed this observation. The one who replied with the warning about not showing the work to anyone else may have been responding specifically to this point. The implication, if followed to its conclusion, is that the entire vocabulary of human civilization rests on inherited terms from a world that the gods had decided should never have existed. We are speaking, every time we use the word Earth or any of its cognates, the name of a place that the Anunnaki destroyed. The harmonic music that held the cities of the Ud-Lalal together has been the subject of more speculation in the leaked academic literature than any other element of the First World's description. The tablet does not give the music itself in any notational form that has survived. What it gives is the structure of the music. The structure is described in mathematical terms that the scribe of K 4131 evidently struggled to render in cuneiform, and that the translators have struggled to render in any modern language. The closest approximation that has appeared in print is a passage from a 1979 paper published in an obscure linguistic journal and withdrawn from the journal's archives within 6 months of publication, which described the harmonic principle of the Ud-Lalal as a system in which every sound was the result of 2 prior sounds, and every sound also became the seed of 2 sounds to come. The system was self-generating. Once begun, it could not stop. It could only be silenced from outside. The paper, before it was withdrawn, suggested that the system bore a strong resemblance to the mathematical structure of certain proportional sequences that recur throughout nature. The author of the paper, a young researcher who at the time was completing her doctorate at a European university, was careful to avoid drawing any conclusions about the implications of this resemblance. She did not say that the natural world is constructed on principles that the first world used to construct its cities. She did not say that the spiral of a nautilus shell, or the branching of a tree, or the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower head follows the same harmonic logic that the Ud-Lalal used to compose their civilization. She did not say these things because saying them in an academic paper in 1979 would have ended her career. She implied them. The paper was withdrawn within 6 months. Her career ended anyway. She is mentioned in the bibliographies of 3 subsequent works and is never directly cited. What she had implied was that the first world's destruction was incomplete in a way the Anunnaki had not anticipated. The harmonic structure that the Ud-Lalal had used to build their cities had also been seeded, by their continuous music, into the matter of the planet itself. Stones had absorbed the patterns. Water had absorbed the patterns. Living things, the plants and the simple creatures that existed before the first world ended, had grown into shapes that reflected the patterns. And when the cities were drained and the continents sank and the Ud-Lalal themselves were no more, the patterns remained. They remained in the rocks, they remained in the water. They remained in the genetic structure of every organism that would ever evolve on this planet thereafter. The first world had not been erased, it had been distributed. Its civilization had become the architecture of the natural world. This is the implication that the translator of 1935 was not allowed to publish. This is the implication that the third colleague, the one who wrote the warning letter, would have recognized immediately. And this is the implication that, if true, makes the rest of the tablet impossible to read without a sense of vertigo. Because if the first world's music is woven into the structure of the natural world, then everything that has grown on this planet since, everything that has lived and died on it, everything that has used its materials to build, has been operating inside a remnant of a civilization the gods believed they had destroyed. The Udlalal are not gone. They have become the background. The music has become the medium in which we exist. Ancient cultures around the world preserve memories of an age of light. The Greeks called it the Golden Age, the time of Chronos, when men did not work, did not suffer, and the earth provided everything in abundance. Hesiod described it in language that, when set beside the K, 4131 translation, reads like a child's account of something an adult had once mentioned, and the child had imperfectly remembered. The Hindu traditions speak of the Satya Yuga, the first of the 4 ages, when human beings were closer to the divine and possessed knowledge that has since been forgotten. The Norse remembered Ginnungagap, the great void of light that preceded all things. The Aztec remembered the first sun, the sun of earth, which ended when the first race was devoured. The Hopi describe a first world that was destroyed by fire from above. Across every continent, in cultures that had no possible contact with one another, the memory persists. There was a world before this one. It was made of light. It ended in fire from the sky. The K, 4131 tablet, in 1935, gave the destruction a name. The Izian, the fire from above. And it gave the destruction a reason, which is the detail that none of the other traditions preserved, because the reason was the part the Anunnaki had wanted forgotten. The Udlalal had been destroyed because they did not need the gods. The lesson the Anunnaki had drawn from the destruction was that the next world they built would be a world that could not survive without them. The second world would be designed to fail in their absence. And from that design forward, every world the Anunnaki built on this planet would carry the same architectural flaw, deliberately introduced, deliberately maintained. Each subsequent civilization would be made dependent. The dependence was the point. Modern researchers who have tried to identify the location of Kurgal have proposed several candidates. Some have argued for an Antarctic landmass, ice-free at the time of the First World, that has since been covered by the polar cap. Others have proposed a North Atlantic continent corresponding to the lost lands of the Hyperborean tradition. Still others have suggested that Kurgal was located in what is now the Pacific Ocean, on the great submerged plateau the geologists call Zealandia, or further west, in the area that the older mythologies remembered as Mu or Lemuria. The tablet itself gives no coordinates that can be converted into modern geography. What it gives is descriptions. Vast, higher than any current land, lit from within. None of these descriptions narrow the location to a single candidate. All of them are consistent with several. The first world's location remains, as the tablet seems to have intended, lost. But the engravings beneath the water, the tablet insists, are still there. And the music that they hold can still, if anything still listens, be heard. The translator of 1935, in his final marginal note on this section, wrote a single word that the junior curator, who later copied the manuscript, misread for a long time before recognizing what it actually said. The word was listen. The translator had written it 3 times, in a column down the margin. Listen, listen, listen. He had circled the third one, and he had drawn an arrow from the circle to the next page, where the tablet's description of the second world began, as if to suggest that the listening was the work that the next section would interrupt. As if to warn the reader that what came next was the part that would distract from the music, the part that was loud, the second world, the world that the Anunnaki built to replace the first. The world that, the tablet says, was the first true beginning of what they had come to this planet to do. This is the first thing the tablet describes, the Ud-Lal-Lal, the world of light, the civilization that was destroyed not for its failures but for its perfection, and the record, etched into the stones beneath the oceans, that the Anunnaki could not erase. The second world followed. It was different in every way. The second world is called, on the tablet, the Nagalam. The closest English rendering is the stone-heavy ones, or in some readings the ones who bear the stone. The phrase is functional rather than descriptive. Where the Ud-Lal-Lal had been named for what they were, the Nagalam were named for what they did. They lifted. They built. They moved the substance of the earth. And the substance of the earth, the tablet says, was what they themselves were largely composed of. The Anunnaki having ended the first world for the crime of being complete, had decided on a different approach. The second world's inhabitants would not be made of light. They would not be self-sustaining. They would not, the tablet says, be capable of the kind of harmonic existence that had made the first world so impossible to use. The Nagalam were designed from the beginning to be useful. The Sumerian word the tablet uses for their purpose, kin, would later come to mean simply work, in the sense of labor or task. In this earliest use, on K 4131, the word seems to carry a heavier weight. It means burden. It means weight to be carried. The Nagalam were not just workers. They were burden bearers, and what they were designed to bear was stone. They were giants. The tablet is unambiguous on this point. The Nagalam stood between 4 and 6 meters in height, depending on the bloodline and the region, with the largest of them, the leaders of the building crews, sometimes exceeding 8 meters. Their bodies were not human. Their skin was the color of weathered granite. Their bones, the tablet says, were partly mineralized. Fused with the stone, they had been bred to move, so that, when one of them died and the flesh decayed, what remained in the ground was not a skeleton in the conventional sense, but a kind of stone scaffold, indistinguishable to the casual observer from the rock that surrounded it. This is the detail, more than any other, that has fascinated the small number of researchers who have been allowed access to the K 4131 translation. Because the implication, stated plainly on the tablet, is that the bones of the Nagalam are still here, in the bedrock, in the foundations of mountains, in the substrate of certain ancient quarries that have always produced stones with strange internal striations that the geologists have struggled to explain. The Nagalam had a culture, but the tablet is dismissive about it. They sang while they worked, but their songs were simple, repetitive, and served no purpose beyond keeping the rhythm of their labor coordinated. They had a language, but the language had only a few hundred words, almost all of them related to types of stone, methods of cutting, and directions of movement. They had no philosophy. They had no art that was not also a tool. They had no concept of leisure, because the Anunnaki had bred them without the capacity for it. The tablet's account of the Nagalam reads, in its tone, like a manager describing a crew, competent, strong, reliable, not interesting. What they built, however, was interesting, and what they built has survived. The tablet describes the second world as the age in which the great stone structures of the planet were raised. Not all of them. Some of the structures we now consider ancient were built much later by the inhabitants of the fifth world, who used techniques they had inherited and could no longer fully understand. But the oldest of them, the foundations beneath the foundations, the courses of cyclopean masonry that no historical civilization has been able to explain, the perfectly fitted stones that weigh hundreds of tons and that no current technology could place with the precision they exhibit, these are the work of the Nagalam. The tablet lists, by Sumerian name, 15 of the major construction projects of the Second World. The list has been studied carefully by the small number of researchers who have seen it. The Sumerian names do not map directly onto any modern place names. But when the descriptions of location, scale, and architectural feature are matched against known megalithic sites around the world, the correspondences are striking enough that one researcher, in a memorandum that surfaced in 2003 and was almost immediately retracted, suggested that the tablet's 15 sites included, at minimum, the foundations beneath Baalbek, the substructures of the Giza Plateau, the walls of Sacsayhuaman, the platform of Tiwanaku, the megaliths of Karnak, the underwater complex at Yonaguni, the older portions of Göbekli Tepe, the underground passages beneath Derinkuyu, the dolmen field at Antequera, and several others. The technique by which the Nagalam moved stone is described in the tablet in detail that the translators have found difficult to render in modern terms. The Nagalam did not use levers or ropes or any of the mechanical aids that human civilizations have employed for moving heavy objects. They used sound. The Sumerian phrase the tablet uses, Dugan, literally the speech of stone, refers to a technique in which the Nagalam would gather around a block of stone, sometimes in groups of 30 or 40, and produce a coordinated vocalization. The vocalization, the tablet says, would induce in the stone a state in which its weight was no longer experienced as fixed. The stone would not float. It would not become weightless, but its mass, for the duration of the vocalization, would seem to decouple from the gravity that should have held it in place. The Nagalam could then lift it, move it, position it. The vocalization would end. The stone would settle into its new location, and the connection between mass and weight, which the Nagalam had briefly suspended, would re-establish itself, locking the stone in place with a permanence that no later civilization has been able to match. This technique, the tablet says, was the foundation of every structure the Nagalam built. The cyclopean walls, the impossibly fitted joints, the massive blocks transported across distances that would defeat any modern crane were all produced by the same method. The Nagalam sang to the stone. The stone, in some sense the modern translators have refused to elaborate, heard them. And the stone, having heard them, allowed itself to be moved. There has been speculation, in the leaked literature, about whether the technique survived in any form after the Second World ended. The tablet itself implies that it did not. The Anunnaki, when they destroyed the Nagalam, were careful to take with them the knowledge of how the Duggan worked. The Nagalam themselves did not understand it as a technique that could be taught. They simply did it. It was bred into them. When they were gone, the capacity went with them. Later civilizations would find the structures the Nagalam had left behind and would worship them as the work of gods, and would attempt, sometimes, to imitate them, but the imitations would always be smaller, cruder, less precise. The Romans built impressive masonry, but no Roman work compares to the foundations beneath the Baalbek temple complex. The Inca built impressive stone fitting, but no Inca work compares to the older walls of Sacsayhuaman that the Inca themselves attributed to a prior race. Across the world, in every place where megalithic construction exists, the same pattern recurs. The oldest courses are the most impressive. Everything built on top of them is inferior. The Nagalam left the foundations. The civilizations that came after them could only ever build the upper floors. The relationship between the Nagalam and the Anunnaki was one of pure utility. The tablet describes the Anunnaki of this period as overseers, foremen, occasionally taskmasters. They issued instructions. They specified locations. They told the Nagalam what to build and where to put it. They did not, the tablet says, explain why. The Nagalam did not ask. They had not been bred to ask. They had been bred to lift and to place and to move, and they did what they were told, and they did it well, and the Anunnaki were satisfied with the work. The tablet's description of this arrangement is matter of fact. The Anunnaki had wanted a workforce. They had built one. The workforce performed as designed. This was, the scribe seems to be saying, the model that should have worked. But it did not work. The reason it did not work is not stated explicitly in the tablet. It is implied. And the implication is one of the more disturbing details of the entire document. The Nagalam, despite having been bred for utility and nothing else, despite having no philosophy and no art and no apparent interior life, began, after several thousand years of labor, to do something the Anunnaki had not anticipated. They began to grieve. Not for themselves. Not for their condition. They began to grieve for the stones. The tablet describes this development in a passage that the translator of 1935 marked with a heavy underline and several question marks. The Nagalam, after long periods of working with stone, came to perceive the stone as something more than material. They had been singing to the stones for so many generations that the act of singing had become, for them, a form of relationship. They knew by sound the difference between one quarry and another. They could identify, by the resonance of a single block, which other blocks in the same quarry it had been adjacent to. They began to mourn when a stone was cut and separated from its source. They began to mourn when a block was placed in a structure and could no longer be moved. The work continued. The structures rose. But the Nagalam, in the later centuries of the Second World, were singing songs that had no purpose beyond expressing their distress at what they were doing. The Anunnaki, the tablet says, did not understand this development at first. They had bred the Nagalam to be incapable of complex emotion. They had built into them, at the level of physiology, a kind of emotional ceiling that should have made grief impossible. The grief had emerged anyway, not because the Anunnaki had failed in their engineering, but because the Nagalam had spent so much of their existence in contact with stone, and stone, the tablet implies, has properties that the Anunnaki had not fully understood. The first world had left its harmonic structure embedded in the matter of the planet. The Nagalam, by singing to the stones in their work, were activating that structure. The stones were responding. And the Nagalam, in receiving the response, were learning something that no creature on the planet had been designed to learn. They were learning that the stones were alive, or had been, or carried, within their crystalline structure, the echoes of beings who had once been alive and whose harmonic patterns had been preserved in rock when the First World ended. The Nagalam, by the late centuries of the Second World, were not just builders. They were grievers. They were unintentional historians. They were the only beings on the planet who had ever directly listened to the silenced music of the Udlalal because they had been working with the very stones that the Udlalal had once engraved with their patterns. And the Nagalam, despite their lack of conceptual sophistication, despite their limited language, despite the engineering that should have prevented them from feeling anything at all, were mourning the first world. They were mourning a world they had never seen, that had ended before any of them were born, that they could not have named or described in any words their species possessed. They were mourning it anyway, because the stones were telling them what had happened. And the stones could not be made to stop. This is the reason, the tablet implies, that the Anunnaki destroyed the second world. The Nagalam had become a problem, not because they were rebellious, because they were not rebellious. Not because they had ceased to work, because they had not ceased to work. They had become a problem because they were, through no fault of their own, learning something the Anunnaki had not wanted any of their creations to learn. The first world's existence, the first world's destruction, the fact that there had been worlds before, that those worlds had been ended deliberately, that the gods who oversaw them now were not the first gods this planet had hosted. The Nagalam, in their songs of grief, were beginning to articulate this. Not in words. They did not have the words, but in the patterns of their mourning, in the rhythms of the silences between their work songs. In the way they would sometimes stop in the middle of a task and simply stand, holding their tools, listening to a stone they had cut, as if waiting for it to finish, telling them something. The Anunnaki could not allow this to continue. The second world had served its purpose. The major structures had been built. The foundations were in place. What remained could be completed by smaller, less capable workers who would not pose the same risk. The Nagalam had to go. The destruction of the second world was called, on the tablet, the Saki, the breaking of the earth. The Sumerian phrase carries a sense of violent rupture, of something solid being torn apart along a fault line. The Anunnaki, the tablet says, had identified the seams of the planet's crust. They had developed, in the period between the first and second worlds, a technology that could exploit those seams. The technology is not named directly. It is referred to obliquely as the splitter, or as the tool that finds the weakness. What the technology did was simple. It introduced, into the geological structure of the planet, a series of precisely placed disturbances. The disturbances triggered movement along the faults. The movement, once begun, could not be stopped. The Earth shook for 136 days. The tablet is specific about the number, 136. The shaking was not continuous. It came in waves, each wave more violent than the last. The Nagalam, who had been spread across the continents of the Second World, working on dozens of construction projects simultaneously, found themselves crushed beneath the very stones they had been moving. The structures they had built held. The walls did not fall. The Cyclopean foundations stayed in place, as they have stayed in place ever since, surviving every subsequent geological convulsion the planet has experienced. But the workers were not so durable. The Nagalam died in the quarries. They died on the construction sites. They died in the tunnels and in the chambers and in the open plains where they had been moving blocks from one place to another. Their stone bones settled into the bedrock, became part of it, and remained. A small number of them survived the initial shaking. These were the ones who had been in the deepest chambers, the underground complexes the Nagalam had carved into the living rock for purposes that the tablet does not fully explain. They survived the breaking of the earth by being below it. When the shaking finally stopped, they emerged. They found a world reshaped. The continents had not changed shape exactly, but the surface of the planet was disturbed everywhere. Mountains had risen, valleys had collapsed, rivers had changed course. The cities of the Second World, where they had not been the Cyclopean structures designed to survive, were gone. Their fellow workers were gone. And the Anunnaki, the survivors discovered when they searched, had withdrawn, had left the planet entirely, had retreated to Nibiru or to wherever they kept themselves between projects, to wait for the dust to settle and to begin the next world. The survivors were on their own. The tablet describes their fate in language that has been described by every researcher who has read it as the most affecting passage on K 4131. The Nagalam survivors, perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 of them across the entire planet, scattered in groups of a few dozen, set out to find each other. They walked, for decades, the tablet says. They walked across the broken landscapes of a world that no longer had any purpose for them. They sought out each other's groups by the sounds of their work songs, which they continued to sing even though there was no longer any work to be done. They gathered, eventually, into a single large group, on a plateau, in what would later become the central regions of Asia, and they built one final structure, not a foundation, not a wall, a circle of stones, of monumental size. arranged in a pattern that the tablet says was the harmonic signature of the Udlalal civilization, the signature the Nagalam had learned by listening to the stones. This circle, the tablet says, was the only structure ever built on this planet that knew what it was. The Nagalam, in their final act, had used the technique they had been bred for, the Dugan, to assemble a monument that was simultaneously a mourning, a remembrance, and a warning. They left it standing, and then they sat down beside it and waited to die. Because their species had been built for labor, and there was no more labor, and they had no concept of what to do with themselves in the absence of work, they sat down, they sang. And one by one, over a period the tablet describes as 2 or 3 of the planet's slow rotations around its sun, they fell silent. The circle they left has not been found. Or it has been found and not recognized. Or it was destroyed in the cataclysm that ended the next world. The tablet is ambiguous on its fate. What is not ambiguous is the harmonic signature it carried. That signature, the tablet says, was the same signature the Udlalal had etched into the deep stones of the planet during their final days. The Nagalam had inherited the music, had carried it, had built it in monumental stone as the last act of their existence. The first world's music had passed from light to stone, and now from stone to memorial. The chain was not broken. The Anunnaki had ended 2 worlds. The signature of the first one was still being transmitted forward. The traces of the Nagalam, beyond the megalithic structures themselves, persist in human memory under 1,000 names. Every culture that has encountered the remains of their work has invented a category to describe the builders. The Greeks called them the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants who had built the walls of Tiryns and Mycenae in an age before history. The Hebrew scriptures called them the Nephilim, the fallen ones, who walked the earth before the flood and whose offspring were giants. The Norse called them the Jotnar, the frost giants, whose bones formed the mountains. The Aztec called them the Quinametsin, the giants who had built Teotihuacan and Cholula before being destroyed in an earlier sun. The Andean peoples spoke of the race of giants who had built Tiwanaku in a single night before the sun rose for the first time. The Polynesians spoke of the Menehune. The Irish spoke of the Fomorians. Across every continent that humans have ever settled, the same memory recurs. There were giants. They built things. They are gone. We do not know exactly what happened to them. The tablet says what happened to them. They were killed by an engineered earthquake, the most precise act of geological violence in the history of the planet, undertaken by the same gods who had bred them, for reasons those gods believed at the time were necessary. The Nagalam died in the construction sites where they had worked, beneath the stones they themselves had cut. Their bones, mineralized, fused with the rock, are still in the foundations of the planet. Geological surveys that have, on rare occasions, encountered anomalous formations deep within the bedrock of certain quarries and mountain ranges have, the leaked literature suggests, sometimes been suppressed. A 1,957 survey of the substructure beneath the Baalbek platform produced sounding data that the chief geologist of the project described, in a private letter that surfaced 30 years later, as inconsistent with any natural origin for the deeper strata. The survey was not published. The geologist did not press the matter. He had a family. What makes the Second World's case particularly difficult to dismiss is the simple physical reality of the structures that remain. The megalithic foundations of Baalbek include 3 stones, the trilithon, that weigh between 800 and 1,000 metric tons each. No crane in the world today can lift them. They have been in their current positions, set with millimeter precision, for an age that the most generous mainstream estimates put in the early Roman period and that the alternative researchers put in a much earlier era altogether. The mainstream estimate cannot account for how they got there. The alternative estimate cannot account either, except by invoking technologies that, the tablet says, were the Dugan, the speech of stone, the method by which the Nagalam coordinated their voices and persuaded the matter of the earth to release its hold on weight. The Saki, the breaking of the earth, has left geological signatures as well. The leaked literature includes references to a stratum of disturbed sediment that appears, with surprising consistency, in core samples taken from widely separated locations around the world. The stratum dates, by the most cautious estimates, to a period far older than any recorded civilization, but younger than the more ancient geological periods that would explain it as a natural occurrence. It contains in some samples traces of minerals that should not appear together in the proportions observed. Some researchers have suggested it is the signature of a series of simultaneous tectonic events that no purely natural cause could produce. They have been told, in academic settings, that this is not the kind of conclusion that should appear in a peer-reviewed journal. They have, in most cases, accepted the correction. A few have not. The second world ended. The Nagalam died. The circle of stones, wherever it was placed, transmitted forward what it could. And the planet, for the second time in its history, sat empty under the sky, while the Anunnaki, on Nibiru or wherever else they kept themselves between projects, prepared the design of the world that would come next. The third world would receive it next, and the third world, the tablet says, would be the one in which the music finally began to be understood. The third world is called, in the tablet's terminology, the Imgirgir. The phrase has been translated variously as the Wind Lords, the Storm Folk, or, in the most recent rendering by the small group of Sumerian linguists who have worked with leaked portions of the K4131 manuscript, the ones whose wind returns. The last translation is the one preferred by those who have read the full passage. It captures something the simpler renderings miss. The Imgirgir were beings whose existence was structured by movement through air, and whose wind, having gone out from them, would always come back. They breathed. The breathing was not, as it is for us, a process of survival. The breathing was the breathing of the planet itself, channeled through them, and then released again into the atmosphere, refined by passage through their bodies. The Imgirgir did not just live in the wind, they were a stage in the wind's cycle. The atmosphere of the third world passed through them, and the atmosphere was different when it came out than when it had gone in. The Anunnaki had built them, the tablet says, in direct response to what had gone wrong with the second world. The Nagalam had failed because they had spent too much time in contact with the stones of the planet, and the stones had taught them what the Anunnaki had not wanted them to know. The solution, in the design of the third world, was to lift the new inhabitants off the ground entirely. The Imgirgir would not touch stone. They would not be heavy. They would not, ideally, have any contact with the substrate of the planet at all. They would live above it. They would breathe its air. They would influence its weather. But they would not handle its rocks. They would not engrave its surfaces. They would not, the Anunnaki hoped, become entangled with the inherited music of the first world that had infected the second. This was the design. The execution was magnificent. The third world's beings were, by every account preserved on the tablet, the most beautiful of any of the previous five. They had bodies that were physical, but only barely. Their substance was air made dense enough to hold a shape, but not so dense that the air would lose its essential quality of motion. They could be seen, the tablet says, but the seeing was difficult. They flickered. They blurred at their edges. They were always slightly translucent. When they moved, they did not so much travel through the air as travel as the air, becoming temporarily a particular pattern in the wind, then dissolving back into general motion, then reforming somewhere else. The tablet describes them, in one passage, as the wind that has decided to become someone. The image is striking. It is also, the leaked literature suggests, the closest anyone has come to a working definition of what the Imgirgir actually were. They lived in cities, but the cities were unlike anything either of the previous worlds had constructed. The cities of the Imgirgir were floating structures. The Sumerian word the tablet uses is Anmar, which translates literally as sky chariot, but in this context seems to mean something more elaborate. The cities were sustained aloft by mechanisms the tablet does not fully explain. They are described as vast platforms, kilometers across in some cases, that rode the high atmosphere of the planet at altitudes the tablet specifies in measurements that have proven difficult to convert into modern units. The lowest of the cities sat at what one researcher estimated as approximately 12 kilometers above the surface. The highest sat at altitudes that would be, by modern reckoning, in the upper stratosphere, in conditions that no creature with conventional lungs could possibly survive. The Imgirgir thrived there. The high cities were considered, in their own civilization, the most prestigious places to live. The closer to the edge of the atmosphere, the more refined the air, and the more refined the inhabitants who had attuned themselves to it. The cities moved. This is one of the details that has, in the leaked literature, attracted the most attention. The Imgirgir cities were not stationary platforms. They drifted with the prevailing winds of the upper atmosphere. They followed seasonal patterns. They migrated, in some cases, from one hemisphere of the planet to the other over the course of a year. The inhabitants of these floating cities did not have a fixed home in the way that the inhabitants of the previous worlds had. Their home was the atmospheric layer at a particular altitude, and their cities moved through that layer, and they moved with the cities. To meet someone in the third world, the tablet implies, was a matter of calculating where the relevant cities would be at the time of the meeting, and arranging the meeting accordingly. The civilization had a temporal dimension to its geography that the Anunnaki had not seen in any of their prior creations. The Imgirgir lived in cities that were also calendars. The position of the city told you what month it was. The altitude of the city told you what hour. The shape of the city, which deformed slowly over years as different winds shaped its outer edges, told you, if you could read it, where in the long cycle of the Imgurgir civilization you currently were. They had craft. The tablet refers to these craft, which the Imgurgir used to travel between cities and to descend, when necessary, to the surface of the planet, by a name that has been transliterated as Kigubin. The phrase translates as the footstanding of heaven, or perhaps the heaven stander, or, in the rendering preferred by some translators, the thing that lets heaven set itself down. The craft were small. They could carry one or two of the Imgurgir. They were used primarily for intercity visits and for the rare ceremonial descents to the surface, which occurred only on specific occasions and only at specific places. The descents were carefully restricted because the Anunnaki had been explicit when they designed the Third World that the Imgurgir should not spend significant time on the ground. The reasons for the restriction were not fully shared with the Imgurgir themselves. They were told, in their educational traditions, that the surface was dangerous, that it was filled with the residue of prior failures, that to descend was to risk contamination by something they would not be able to identify or remove. They believed this. They observed the restriction. The descents, when they happened, were brief. The descriptions of the Kigubin in the tablet are detailed enough that several researchers in the leaked literature have noted the close correspondence with the descriptions of Vimana craft in the Hindu traditions. The Vedic and Puranic texts describe flying machines, used by the gods and by certain advanced human beings of a previous age, that match the K4131 descriptions in almost every particular. The propulsion is described, in both bodies of literature, as based on a method of disturbing the natural state of the air immediately around the craft, in such a way that the craft can be pushed by the same forces that ordinarily move clouds and weather systems. The interiors are described as small, light, and configured to accommodate one or two passengers. The materials are described as not quite metallic, not quite ceramic, with properties of strength and lightness that no known earthly substance combines. The correspondence is striking enough that one researcher, in a paper that was withdrawn before it could be properly cited, suggested that the Hindu traditions of Vimana craft are simply a memory, preserved across an enormous span of time, of the Imgurgir's everyday transportation technology. The culture of the Third World was, by the tablet's account, the richest and most developed of any civilization the planet had hosted up to that point. The Imgurgir, freed from the requirements of physical labor by the design of their world, were able to develop arts, philosophies, and sciences that occupied their entire civilization, they wrote. The writing was not preserved in physical form, because the Imgurgir did not believe in committing thought to material substrate. Their writing was atmospheric. They would compose, in the air around them, patterns of pressure and temperature that could be read by other Imgurgir who knew the conventions of the script. The compositions would last for hours or days, depending on the weather. Then they would dissipate. Their literature was, by design, ephemeral. To read an Imgurgir poem was to read something that would not exist tomorrow. To read a work of philosophy was to read something that the author had created, knowing it would be read by only a few thousand of his contemporaries and never by anyone else. The Anunnaki considered this arrangement, the tablet says, ideal. The Imgurgir would not, by virtue of their commitment to ephemeral expression, leave records that could outlast them. There would be no second world problem of inherited information seeping through the stones. There would be no risk of any later civilization picking up the Third World's accumulated knowledge and using it against the gods who had designed both worlds. The Imgurgir would think, and speak, and write in the air, and their thoughts would die with them. Their civilization would, in effect, be unrecoverable. Even its destruction would leave nothing behind, because there would be nothing to destroy. This was the assumption. The assumption was wrong. The tablet's account of how the assumption proved wrong is one of the more philosophically interesting passages on K, 4131. The Imgurgir, in their attempt to leave nothing material behind, had developed, over many generations, an extraordinary skill at compressing meaning into atmospheric pattern. Their writing was so dense, so layered, so saturated with reference to prior writing, that a single composition could, by the end of the Third World's history, contain the embedded contents of thousands of earlier compositions, each of which had referenced thousands of earlier ones, and so on back to the beginning of their literature. The atmosphere of the Third World, in its late period, was thick with this kind of writing. It was, the tablet says, the most articulate atmosphere in the history of the planet. The wind itself had become a library. Every gust carried, encoded in its patterns, the cumulative literature of an entire civilization. The Imgur did not realize, at first, what this meant. They thought of their writing as a kind of ongoing conversation, a way of being present to each other across distance. They did not think of it as a record. But the planet's atmosphere does not entirely disperse. It cycles. The same air that holds a poem in one moment will, decades or centuries later, be circulating through a different region, encoding now different patterns, but carrying, in some subtle residue at the level of molecular arrangement, the memory of what it had carried before. The Imgur, by writing in the air for tens of thousands of years, had been inadvertently building a record that was distributed throughout the entire atmospheric system of the planet. Their literature was not ephemeral. It was inscribed, not on any single surface but on the cycling pattern of the air itself. And the air, like the stone before it, had a kind of memory. The Anunnaki, when they began to notice this, were displeased. The same pattern that had emerged in the Second World was emerging again. A civilization that had been designed to be controllable was, through no fault of the designers and no rebellion of the designed, accumulating capacities that would make future control more difficult. The atmosphere was learning. The Imgur were teaching it. And what they were teaching it, in the dense, compressed literature of their late period, included an increasing number of speculations about the nature of the gods who had created them. The Imgur philosophers had begun to wonder why they had been told not to touch the ground. They had begun to wonder what was on the ground that they were being protected from. They had, in some of the most recent compositions, begun to write in the air the question of whether the protection was for their sake or for someone else's. The tablet describes the Anunnaki's response to this development with an economy that the translator of 1935 found unsettling. The Anunnaki, the scribe says, did not deliberate at length. They had been through this before. They had seen, in the Second World, where this kind of trajectory led. They acted promptly. The destruction of the Third World was called, on the tablet, the Imhal, the evil wind. The phrase appears in other Mesopotamian texts, where it is usually translated as a generic curse, a malevolent atmospheric force invoked by sorcerers or sent by displeased gods to punish enemies. On K4131, the phrase has a specific meaning. It refers to a particular meteorological event, engineered by the Anunnaki, that affected the entire planet over a period of approximately 3 weeks. The Imhal was not, the tablet specifies, a storm in the conventional sense. It was a disturbance in the basic circulation of the planet's atmosphere. The Anunnaki, the tablet says, had identified the principal currents of the upper atmosphere, the jet streams and the great rotating cells that determine the planet's climate, and they had introduced into these currents a series of precisely placed disruptions. The disruptions interacted with each other. They built. Within days, the upper atmosphere was in a state of catastrophic instability. The currents that had held the Imgur cities aloft began to fail. The cities began to fall. The first of the high cities to descend, the tablet says, fell from an altitude of nearly 30 kilometers. It took hours to reach the ground. The Imgur who lived in it watched as it fell. The atmospheric writing of their own civilization scrambled and dispersed by the violent crosswinds. Their last compositions, the tablet says, were attempts to record what was happening. Attempts to leave a trace. The traces were torn apart as fast as they could be written. By the time the city impacted the surface of the planet, in a region of empty ocean far from any other city, the literature of the Third World's final hours had been erased by the same winds that had ordinarily preserved it. The other cities followed. Some fell quickly, some drifted, off course, for weeks, before colliding with mountains or descending into seas. The Imgur themselves, deprived of the high atmospheric conditions their bodies required, began to thin out. Their substance, which had always been air given temporary form, returned to general atmosphere. They did not exactly die. They diffused. The Sumerian phrase the tablet uses for what happened to them, Sumunan Ta, translates as becoming sky again, or returning to the air from which they came. By the end of the Imhal, the Third World's population was no longer locatable as discrete individuals. They were everywhere. They were nowhere. They were the wind. And here is where the tablet describes the development that the Anunnaki had not foreseen, and that may have been, in their long history of creating and destroying worlds, the closest they ever came to making a mistake they could not correct. The Imgur, in the act of diffusing, did not lose their information. The patterns they had inscribed in the atmosphere were now patterns they were themselves part of. The library they had built was the same library they had become. The Third World civilization had not been destroyed. It had been integrated into the planet's atmospheric system in a way that made it, in some sense, permanent. The wind that blows now, the tablet says, still carries the compressed literature of the Imgur-Gir. The dense weather patterns that meteorologists struggle to predict, the unexpected turbulences, the strange persistent storms are not random. They are the activity of an inscribed atmosphere, still working through compositions that were begun before the Third World ended. The Third World's voice, the tablet says, is still being read, by whatever can read it. The wind speaks. It has been speaking, without interruption, since long before our species existed. And what it speaks, encoded in pressure and temperature and the slow rotation of cells of moving air, is the cumulative literature of a civilization the Anunnaki tried to silence by dissolving its inhabitants into the atmosphere. The dissolution was the silencing. The dissolution was also the publication. The Third World's library, in being scattered, became unsuppressible. Survivors persist in human memory across many cultures. The traditions of feathered serpents, of bird gods, of beings who descended from the sky to teach early humans the rudiments of civilization, all appear in the leaked literature to be memories of the late Imgur-Gir, who, in the final centuries of their world, had begun to descend more often than the Anunnaki's original design had permitted. The descents were brief, the visits were limited, but they happened. And in some cases, the Imgur-Gir taught what they knew to the small populations of creatures they encountered on the surface of the planet, populations that had survived from the Second World's chaotic ending and that were eking out a marginal existence in the harsher landscapes of the post-Saki world. Knowledge was transmitted. Some of it survived into the Fourth World. Some of it survives, in fragmented form, into ours. The Quetzalcoatl traditions of Mesoamerica describe a feathered serpent who came from the sky and taught the people the arts of civilization before withdrawing again to the heavens. The Kukulkan traditions of the Maya describe the same figure under a different name. The Garuda of the Vedic and Buddhist traditions, the Thunderbird of the North American indigenous traditions, the various sky messengers of the Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime, the angels of the Abrahamic traditions, all carry, in different cultural costumes, the same essential memory. There were beings of the air. They came down. They taught. They returned. They are still there, in some sense, in the wind. The tablet, in its description of the Imgur-Gir's final dispersion, gives the framework that makes all of these traditions, taken together, coherent. They were not separate memories of separate beings. They were one memory, fractured across many cultures of the Third World. Modern meteorology has occasionally produced data that, in the leaked literature, has been linked to the persistence of the Imgur-Gir patterns. There are recurring atmospheric anomalies that have, over the past century of systematic observation, defied conventional explanation. There are certain wind patterns that show, in long-term records, a periodicity that does not match any known solar or oceanic driver. There are pressure systems that, when mapped over years, trace out patterns of remarkable geometric regularity. There are sounds. The infrasound recording stations that monitor the atmosphere for nuclear tests and seismic events have, on more than one occasion, captured low-frequency signatures that no known natural source can explain. The signatures repeat. They modulate. They display the kind of pattern that a system designed to monitor for human-made sounds would, if it could think, describe as deliberate. The official explanations involve volcanic outgassing, deep ocean acoustic phenomena, the resonances of certain rock formations under stress. The unofficial explanations, in the leaked literature, point to the K4131 description of the Third World's inscribed atmosphere. The Imgur-Gir, the unofficial explanations suggest, are still writing. They have not stopped writing for 100,000 years. The writing is in the air. It is the air. And the instruments we have built to monitor the air are, without intending it, transcribing the residue of a literature whose authors dissolved into their medium of expression and have, since then, continued to compose. The cities of the Third World, where they fell, have left their own traces. The tablet does not give modern coordinates, but the descriptions of the impact sites have led some researchers to speculate. The deep ocean trenches contain anomalous bathymetric features that have, in certain places, been interpreted as the remains of fallen structures. The Mariana Trench is one candidate. The Puerto Rico Trench is another. The deep regions of the South Atlantic, near the area sometimes called the South Atlantic Anomaly because of its peculiar magnetic field characteristics, contain features that one researcher has suggested could be the remains of one of the larger Imgur-Gir cities. The proposal has not been pursued through any official channel. The funding required for the kind of deep-water investigation that would be needed to confirm or refute it has never materialized. The features remain on the bathymetric maps. They have not been excavated. A small number of the Imgur-Gir, the tablet says, did not fully diffuse. These were the ones who had been, in the final centuries before the Imhul, conducting the unauthorized descents to the surface. Their bodies, by virtue of the time they had spent in the denser air near the ground, had developed a slightly more cohesive quality. When the dispersion came, they did not fully scatter. They held together. They drifted, after the cataclysm, in small bands across the surface of the planet, looking for places where the survivors of the Second World's chaos still lived. They found them. They settled, in a few isolated regions, among the descendants of the Second World's underground refugees. They mixed, not biologically. They could not interbreed with the Nagalam survivors. But they taught. They shared. They became, in the small post-Third World communities that scratched out an existence in the broken landscapes the previous cataclysms had left, the first teachers. The first transmitters of a knowledge that included, in fragments that the Anunnaki had not been able to suppress, references to the existence of prior worlds. This is the contamination that the Anunnaki, in designing the Fourth World, would attempt to address. The Fourth World would be built in such a way that its inhabitants could not, under any circumstances, come into contact with the surviving teachers of the Third. The Anunnaki had learned that lifting their creations off the ground was not sufficient. The teachers had found their way down anyway. The new strategy would be different. The Fourth World's inhabitants would be placed in an environment where the teachers could not reach them at all. The teachers, by their constitution, could not survive below water. The Fourth World, the tablet says, would be the world below water. It would be the deep world. It would be the world the air beings could not enter. The Fourth World would be designed, the tablet says, with the lessons of the Third explicitly in mind. There would be no more ephemeral civilizations. There would be no more attempts to lift the inhabitants off the ground. The Anunnaki, by the time they began designing the Fourth World, had concluded that their previous strategies were not working. Each generation of their creations was, in different ways, accumulating capacities that the Anunnaki did not want them to have. The Fourth World would take a radically different approach. The Fourth World would not be above. It would not be on. The Fourth World would be below. The Fourth World is called, on the tablet, the Ab-Zugal. The Sumerian phrase means literally the great deep, or the great below, and the same compound word survives, much later in the Mesopotamian tradition, as the name of the cosmic freshwater ocean over which the god Enki was said to rule. The connection is not coincidental. The Anunnaki who oversaw the design of the Fourth World were the same group of deities, the tablet says, who would later be remembered in surviving Sumerian and Akkadian literature as the Enki faction. They had argued, in the long councils that followed the Imhul, that the previous three worlds had failed because the Anunnaki had not understood the medium in which the new race needed to be embedded. Light had been too perfect. Stone had been too memorious. Air had been too distributed. What was needed, the Enki faction had argued, was a medium that was opaque, contained, and difficult to access from outside. The medium they proposed was water, deep water. The kind of water that, at sufficient depth, sustains no light, no air, and no possibility of being approached by any creature not specifically designed for the conditions. The Fourth World was built beneath the sea. The tablet specifies that the Ab-Zugal civilization occupied not the upper ocean, where light still penetrates, and where the variations of weather and current still produce something resembling the conditions of the surface, but the abyssal depths, the regions of the ocean below approximately 1,000 meters, where the pressure is enormous, the temperature is uniformly cold, and the darkness is absolute. The inhabitants of this world, the beings the tablet calls the Kuab, were designed specifically for these conditions. They were not, the tablet emphasizes, fish. The word fish is not used. The Kuab were something else. They had bodies adapted for high pressure and total darkness, but they were not creatures of the sort that natural evolution would produce in such an environment. They had been engineered. The Anunnaki had taken the architectural lessons of the previous three worlds and applied them, this time, to a substrate that they believed would be uniquely suited to containment. The Kuab were, in physical terms, the strangest of all the previous inhabitants of this planet. Their bodies were elongated and translucent. Their skin produced its own dim illumination, a soft greenish glow that was sufficient for them to see each other in the absolute darkness of the abyss. They had no eyes in the conventional sense. They perceived their environment through a combination of biological sonar, pressure sensitivity, and a sense the tablet does not name in any way that has been successfully translated, but that seems to involve direct detection of magnetic and electrical fields. They could sense the presence of metal at great distances. They could feel, in the water around them, the movements of currents that originated thousands of kilometers away. They were, in the most literal sense, attuned to the planet itself. Their bodies were instruments. The deep water was the medium their instruments were calibrated for. They lived in cities. The cities of the Fourth World were unlike anything that had come before. The tablet describes them as structures that were partly biological, partly mineral, and partly something that does not fit into either category. The Kuab grew their cities. They did not build them in the way the Nagalam had built. They cultivated them. Each city began as a small living seed, planted in a specific location on the abyssal floor, and grew over generations into a vast architectural form, with chambers and passages and ceremonial spaces and dwellings, all produced by the slow biological accretion of mineral substance around an organic framework. The cities were alive. They responded to the inhabitants. They could be steered, slowly, in their growth, by the directed attentions of the Kuab who lived in them. A city that the Kuab wanted to grow eastward would, over a generation, extend itself eastward. A city that the Kuab wanted to contract would, over a similar period, draw itself in. The Fourth World's architecture was, in this sense, the first architecture on the planet that had ever been collaborative between the builders and the structure itself. The tablet describes 7 of the principal Kuab cities by name. The names are unusual, even by the standards of K. 4,131, full of consonant clusters that the cuneiform sign system struggled to render. The largest of them was called something approximated as Gal, the great place of the deep water. It sat on the abyssal plain of what was then the central basin of the planet's largest ocean. Its precise location, in modern terms, would be in the deepest regions of the Pacific, somewhere between the present positions of the Marianas Trench and the East Pacific Rise. The city was kilometers across at its base, and it rose from the abyssal floor in a series of tiered platforms that the tablet compares in shape to an enormous inverted mountain. The inhabitants moved between the tiers by swimming. The connecting passages were filled with water at the same pressure as the surrounding sea, because the Kuab required the pressure to live. To enter a Kuab city was to remain within the same medium that filled the entire ocean. There were no air chambers. There were no surfaces that were exposed to anything other than water. The civilization was, in this strict sense, fully aquatic. The culture of the Kuab was, the tablet says, the most sophisticated yet developed by any of the previous worlds. The Kuab had philosophy, science, art, and a system of writing that, unlike the Third World's atmospheric inscriptions, was meant to be permanent. They wrote on plates of a mineralized substance that they secreted from glands in their lower bodies, and that hardened, when exposed to seawater of a specific temperature, into something resembling polished black stone. These plates, the tablet says, were stored in vast archive chambers within the cities. They could be read by any Kuab who had been trained in the script. They could be copied, they could be transmitted from city to city. The civilization had, for the first time in the planet's history, a stable and recoverable written record. This was the development that the Anunnaki had been trying to prevent. The Kuab had been designed, the Anunnaki had hoped, to be contained, isolated, and inaccessible. Their writing system should have made them, by virtue of its very permanence, easier to monitor. The plates were physical, they could be inspected, they could, if necessary, be destroyed. But the Anunnaki, in monitoring the development of Kuab literature, began to encounter the same pattern that had appeared in the Second and Third Worlds, and that they had now seen often enough that they should have anticipated it. The Kuab were, in their writings, beginning to speculate about the conditions of their existence. They were beginning to ask why they lived in the deep. They were beginning to notice that there were currents of food and energy that came down from above, where they had been told nothing existed, and they were beginning to wonder about the source of those currents. They were, in short, beginning to think their way upward. The Kuab philosophers in their late period developed a tradition that the tablet calls the upper questioning. The phrase in the Sumerian is anshul shul, with the second word repeated for intensification, suggesting a probing, repeated, persistent kind of inquiry directed toward the regions above the abyss. The Kuab had begun to send expeditions toward the upper ocean. The expeditions were dangerous. The Kuab bodies were not designed for the lower pressures of the shallows. An expedition that ventured too close to the surface risked the catastrophic failure of the explorer's biological integrity. But the expeditions went anyway, and some of them returned. And the returnees brought information. The upper ocean, the returnees reported, was different from what they had been told. It contained light. It contained currents that moved differently than the deep currents. It contained, in the very uppermost regions, a boundary beyond which the water ended entirely, and beyond which there was something else, something the explorers could not enter but could perceive from below, indirectly, as a kind of vast brightness that filled the world above the boundary. The Kuab had discovered, the tablet says, that there was a surface. And once they had discovered it, they began to discover other things. They discovered in the upper ocean the residue of the third world. The Imgirgir, in their dispersion, had not only inhabited the atmosphere. Some of their patterns had settled into the upper ocean, where they had mixed with the surface water and had been slowly carried downward by the ordinary processes of oceanic circulation. The Kuab, swimming into the upper layers, could detect these patterns. They were the third world's writing, the air library, now present in dilute form in the water itself. The Kuab read it, slowly, over generations of returning expeditions. And what they read, encoded in the chemistry and patterns of the upper sea, was the history of the third world, including its destruction, including the names of the Anunnaki who had ordered the Imhul, including the entire pattern of how the gods who had created the Kuab had previously created and destroyed other beings on this planet. The Kuab knew, by the late period of their civilization, what they were. They knew they were the fourth iteration. They knew there had been 3 before them. They knew how those 3 had ended. And they knew, with the cold clarity that came from reading the inscribed currents of the upper sea, that they were headed for the same outcome unless they could prevent it. This is the section of the tablet that has been most aggressively suppressed in the leaked literature. The translator of 1935 made extensive marginal notes on this passage, and the notes that survived in the curator's 1968 copy are unusually emotional in their tone. The translator had recognized, in this part of the K 4131 text, the moment at which a created race had first achieved full knowledge of its own situation. The Kuab, the translator wrote in the margin, were the first. They were the first to know. And they were also, the next several pages of the tablet would establish, the first to attempt to do something about it. What they attempted was a kind of escape. They could not, by their physical nature, leave the deep ocean. They could not survive on land. They could not breathe air. They were trapped in the medium for which they had been designed. But they could, the late Kuab philosophers concluded, build something else. They could build a successor. They could engineer a smaller race, biologically related to themselves but adapted to different conditions. And they could send this successor into the upper ocean, and from there onto the land, where it might survive in some form, and where it might carry forward the knowledge that the Kuab had accumulated about their own situation and the history of the planet. The Kuab undertook, in the final centuries of the Fourth World, a biological engineering project of considerable scope. They created a smaller, more flexible race, capable of surviving in both deep water and shallow water, capable of brief exposure to air, and capable eventually of crawling onto land for limited periods. This race the tablet calls the Lulu Amalu, a phrase that translates roughly as the small mixed people, or perhaps the lesser blended ones. The Lulu Amalu were the Kuab's children, but they were children designed for survival rather than for the abyssal conditions of their parents. They were equipped with all the cumulative knowledge of the Fourth World. They were sent out, in small groups, to the shallows and beyond, to establish themselves on the surface of the planet before whatever the Anunnaki were planning could overtake the rest of the Kuab population. The first of the Lulu Amelu reached the surface, the tablet says, approximately 200 years before the end of the Fourth World. They established themselves in coastal regions, in small communities, and they began the careful work of preserving, in oral traditions and in simple inscriptions on stone, the knowledge their Kuab progenitors had given them. They knew the cataclysm was coming. The Kuab philosophers had calculated it. They did not know when, exactly. They did not know the form, but they knew, from the patterns they had read in the inscribed currents, that the Anunnaki were preparing something. The Lulu Amalu prepared in turn. What the Anunnaki were preparing was the Abhalam, the destruction by water. The phrase, in later Mesopotamian literature, would survive as the standard word for the flood, the great deluge that the Sumerian, Akkadian, and biblical traditions all preserve. On K 4131, the phrase has a specific meaning. It refers to the deliberate disturbance of the planet's hydrological cycle in such a way that the entire ocean would, within a matter of weeks, reorganize itself. The Anunnaki had identified, in the slow circulation of the world's seas, the pattern that maintained the abyssal conditions on which the Kuab depended. They had developed a method for disrupting that pattern. The method involved the introduction of enormous quantities of fresh water into specific points of the global ocean, combined with a destabilization of the deep thermohaline currents that, in the planet's normal functioning, kept the cold abyssal water at the bottom and the warmer surface water at the top. When the Abhalam was executed, the result was catastrophic for the Kuab and devastating for the entire surface of the planet at the same time. The abyssal water rose. The surface water sank. For the first time in the history of the Fourth World, the deep cities were exposed to currents of warm, less pressurized, less consistent water from the upper ocean. The Kuab bodies, calibrated for the absolute conditions of the abyss, could not adjust. They died, slowly at first, and then in catastrophic numbers, as the conditions of their cities deteriorated. The cities themselves, dependent on the steady chemistry of the abyssal water, began to dissolve. The architectures that had been grown over generations, that had been alive and responsive to their inhabitants, lost their structural coherence and broke apart in the disturbed currents. At the same time, on the surface of the planet, the redistribution of water produced effects that no surface ecosystem could have withstood. The seas overflowed their coastlines. Inland regions that had been dry for millennia were inundated. Rivers reversed their flow. Massive volumes of fresh water, having been introduced into the oceans to disrupt the deep currents, now rained back down across the continents as the planet's hydrological cycle attempted to find a new equilibrium. For approximately 150 days, the tablet says, the planet experienced continuous global rainfall, accompanied by tidal events that traveled inland for hundreds of kilometers, accompanied by the catastrophic failure of every coastal settlement that the small Lulu-Amelu populations had established. The greater part of the Lulu-Amelu drowned. The Fourth World was being destroyed simultaneously from below and from above. A small number of the Lulu-Amelu survived. They survived because they had moved, in the years leading up to the Abhalam, to the highest inland regions they could reach. They had been told, by their Kuab progenitors, that high ground would offer the best chance. They had built simple structures on the elevated plateaus of what would later be remembered as the regions of Mesopotamia, the Andes, the Central Asian highlands, the higher valleys of the Himalayan foothills. From these refuges, they watched the lower world drown. And when the rain eventually stopped, and the waters receded, and the planet began the slow process of finding its new stable configuration, the surviving Lulu-Amelu came down from the highlands and began to repopulate the broken landscapes of what would, in time, become the foundation for the Fifth World. The Anunnaki had not known about the Lulu-Amelu. The Kuab had hidden them. The construction of a successor race had been undertaken in secret, in the deepest regions of the Fourth World, where the Anunnaki monitoring of Kuab activities was least precise. The Lulu-Amelu emerged onto the post-flood surface of the planet as an unexpected variable. They were not in the Anunnaki's plan. They were carrying, in their oral traditions and their crude stone inscriptions, the cumulative knowledge of the Fourth World, including the explicit knowledge of how the Anunnaki had created and destroyed previous civilizations. The cataclysm survives in human memory under every name the language of flood has ever been given. The Sumerian account of Utnapishtim, the Akkadian account of Atrahasis, the biblical account of Noah, the Greek account of Deucalion, the Aztec account of Tata and Nene, the Maya account of the destruction of the fourth sun by water, the Hindu account of Manu and the fish god who saved him, the Chinese account of Yu the Great and the floods that took 22 years to control, the Polynesian accounts of the flood that drowned the ancestors, the Australian Aboriginal accounts of the rising waters. Every culture on every continent preserves the memory. The flood happened. It happened to everyone. And the survivors of it, the tablet says, were not random groups of righteous humans saved by individual divine intervention. They were a single biological population, the Lulu-Amelu, who had been engineered by a civilization the floods were specifically designed to destroy, and who had carried, into the world that followed, everything the engineered race had known. The fish god traditions that appear across Mesopotamian iconography are, the tablet seems to suggest, memories of the Kuab themselves. The figure of Oannes, the fish-bodied teacher who came out of the Persian Gulf in the time of the antediluvian kings to teach humans the arts of civilization, is a memory of the late Lulu-Amelu emergence from the seas. The Dagon traditions of the Philistines, the Triton of the Greeks, the various aquatic culture heroes of the early Egyptian and Indian traditions are all, the tablet implies, derivative of the same source. The Fourth World survivors, blending with the small remaining populations of post-Third World survivors who had inhabited the surface in their few previous centuries, established the foundations of what would become the Fifth World's first cities. They taught, they wrote, they preserved. Some of what they preserved, the tablet says, was the knowledge of the previous worlds in their entirety. The Lulu-Amelu, in their long secret development in the late Fourth World, had been given access to the Kuab archives. They had learned the histories the Kuab philosophers had reconstructed from the inscribed currents of the Upper Sea. They knew about the Udlalal, they knew about the Nagalam, they knew about the Imgurgur, and they passed this knowledge on, in increasingly degraded form, to the populations they founded after the Abhalam. The Sumerian king list, the Egyptian dynastic records, the various antediluvian traditions that survive in fragmentary form across the ancient world are, the tablet implies, the eroded remnants of what the Lulu Amalu had originally preserved as a complete history. The kings with reigns of thousands of years, the lists of rulers who came before the flood, the names of the cities that existed before history. All of these, the tablet says, are real. They are the imperfect memory of the fifth world for what the fourth world's successor race had taught it. The drowned cities of the Kuab are still there. The tablet specifies that the architectures of the fourth world, although disrupted by the Abhalam, were not entirely destroyed. The great inverted mountain of Engergal in the central Pacific basin partially survived. Its lower tiers, which had been the most deeply embedded in the abyssal floor, retained their structural integrity even after the currents that had sustained them changed. Other Kuab cities in other ocean basins similarly persisted in fragmentary form. The deep ocean ruins that very occasional bathymetric surveys have detected over the past decades in various regions of the abyssal plain are not, the tablet implies, natural formations. They are the remnants. They are what the Kuab built, growing it over generations, that the flood was not able to wash away. Several of these features are known to deep-sea researchers and have been discussed in the careful, hedged language that the academic literature uses when it encounters something that cannot be easily explained. The Yonaguni Monument, off the coast of Japan, is one such feature, although that one lies in much shallower water than the abyssal sites the tablet describes. The deeper anomalies that have been detected by sonar in the Central Pacific and the deep Atlantic basins are less publicly discussed. The funding to investigate them properly has, in nearly every case, been redirected to other projects. The reports that have been filed have been classified, in some cases, under categories that have nothing obviously to do with marine archaeology. The pattern of suppression is consistent with what the tablet implies. The deep ocean ruins of the Fourth World are still there. They are intact enough that anyone who reached them could examine them. The reaching of them has been, in every case anyone has attempted it, made difficult by considerations that have always been, on inspection, the result of decisions made by institutions with reasons of their own. The fifth world, the tablet says, would be the world we are about to describe. It would be the most complex world the Anunnaki had ever built. It would be the world in which they would finally attempt, after 4 failures, to create a civilization that they believed they could keep under their control indefinitely. It would also be the world in which they would, for reasons the tablet treats as the most disturbing of all of K, 4,131, finally find themselves directly opposed by a force they had not expected, and that they did not, in the end, manage to defeat. The fifth world is called, on the tablet, the Nam Lugal, Kalama. The phrase has been translated as the reign of the kings, or the kingship across the lands, and it is the same phrase that appears in a slightly later orthographic form as the opening line of the document known to modern scholarship as the Sumerian king list. The connection is not incidental. The Sumerian king list, as recovered from later tablets, is the Lulu Amelu's preserved memory of the fifth world's royal lineages, condensed and abbreviated by generations of copying but still containing, in its strange numerical claims and its lists of impossibly long reigns, the residue of what the K4131 tablet describes in detail. The fifth world's kings reigned for thousands of years. The fifth world's cities are named. The fifth world's history is, in the most general outline, exactly what the surviving Sumerian tradition preserved, even after thousands of years of degradation. The tablet, for the first time in its account of the previous worlds, is describing a civilization whose existence is corroborated in fragmentary form by other documents in the Mesopotamian corpus. This is the world the scribe of K4131 was writing in. This is the world that was ending while he wrote. And this is, for that reason, the most detailed of all the tablet's descriptions, because the scribe was describing not a distant memory passed down through inscribed currents and sung to stones, but the immediate context of his own existence, the civilization that surrounded him as he worked. The fifth world began, the tablet says, approximately 10,000 years after the end of the fourth. The Anunnaki had taken longer between the fourth and fifth worlds than between any of the previous pairs. The reasons given on the tablet are practical. The Anunnaki had needed time to recalibrate. They had needed to study the unexpected variable of the Lulu Amalu, the survivor population of the Fourth World that had been left scattered across the highlands after the Abhalam. They had needed to decide what to do about these survivors. And they had needed, ultimately, to incorporate them into the design of the new world, because eliminating them entirely would have required another cataclysm before the planet had even begun to recover from the previous one. And the Anunnaki had decided, for reasons the tablet attributes partly to fatigue and partly to a strategic reassessment, that they would no longer destroy worlds purely to start over. From this point forward, the tablet implies the Anunnaki would build on what they had. The Lulu Amelu would be the seed stock. The fifth world would be raised, not from nothing, but from the surviving remnant of the fourth. This decision had consequences the Anunnaki, the tablet says, did not fully anticipate. The Lulu Amalu carried, in their oral traditions and in the simple inscriptions they had managed to make on stone, the cumulative knowledge of the previous worlds. They knew. The Anunnaki, in agreeing to use them as the foundation of the new civilization, had agreed to build the new civilization on a population that already possessed the information the Anunnaki had spent 4 worlds trying to keep hidden. The decision was made anyway. The reasoning, as the tablet preserves it, was that the knowledge could be diluted over generations, that the Lulu Amelu's descendants would eventually forget what their ancestors had known, that oral traditions would erode under the pressure of distance and time. This reasoning, the tablet says, was mostly correct. The knowledge did erode. By the late Fifth World, what the antediluvian populations remembered of the previous worlds was a confused mythology, full of contradictions, that no longer carried the precise information the Lulu Amalu had originally preserved. But the erosion was not complete. Enough remained, in the late Fifth World, that the existence of the previous worlds was still vaguely known. Enough remained that the kings of the late Fifth World, the figures preserved in the Sumerian king list, were aware, in some attenuated form, of the pattern they were the latest iteration of. The Anunnaki engineered the new race differently than they had any of their previous creations. The Fifth World's inhabitants would be, the tablet says, a hybrid. They would carry, in their physical and mental constitution, elements from each of the previous 4 worlds, deliberately blended in such a way that no single previous lineage would dominate. They would have the harmonic capacities of the Udlal, much diminished. They would have the physical strength and stone affinity of the Nagalam, much reduced from the giant proportions of that earlier race but still detectable. They would have the air attunement of the Imgirgir, present in a vestigial form as the capacity for vivid imagination and dreaming. They would have the deep water adaptability of the Kuab, transmitted through the Lulu Amalu, as a kind of underlying biological resilience and capacity for high-pressure environments. They would be, in their composite nature, the most adaptable race the planet had hosted. They would also be, the tablet implies, the most fragile. The blending had been undertaken without full understanding of how the previous traits would interact. The result was a being that could do many things, but that was vulnerable in ways that none of the previous races had been vulnerable. This being, the tablet calls, in the Sumerian, the Nam Lugal, which translates as the royal people, or the people who will rule. The terminology is significant. The Fifth World's inhabitants were, by design, not merely workers, like the Nagalam, or aesthetic ephemerals, like the Imgirgir, or specialized abyssal beings, like the Kuab. They were rulers. They were intended, from the beginning, to be a stratified civilization, with kings at the top and various ranks of subjects below them. The kings were to be, in their bodies, more directly hybrid with the Anunnaki themselves. The tablet describes the original kings of the Fifth World as semi-divine, in the most literal biological sense. The Anunnaki had contributed genetic material directly to the royal lineages. The first kings of the antediluvian period were, in their cellular composition, partly Anunnaki. They were taller than the general population, they lived longer. The thousands of years assigned to them in the Sumerian king list are not, the tablet says, metaphor. They are reasonably accurate measurements of the actual lifespans of beings whose biology incorporated direct contributions from a race that itself was, by the standards of the planet, extremely long-lived. The cities of the Fifth World are named, on the tablet, in the same sequence that the Sumerian king list preserves. The first city was Eridu, founded at the mouth of what would later become the Persian Gulf. The first king of Eridu was Alulim. He reigned for 28,800 years, according to the king list. The number the tablet implies is approximately correct, although the units of time used in the original measurement were not identical to later Mesopotamian years. Alulim was followed by Alalgar. Then the kingship moved to Bad Tabira, where Enmen-Luana reigned, and then Bad Tabira's other kings, then to Larak, then Sippar, then finally to Shuruppak, which was the city where the scribe of K4131 was working when he produced the document we are reading. The lineage of kings is unbroken from Alulim to the scribe's contemporary, Ubartutu, the last king of Shuruppak before the cataclysm. The lineage is also, the tablet emphasizes, a single biological line. The original Anunnaki contribution had been concentrated and had been preserved through specific marriage and inheritance patterns, so that by the late Fifth World the royal line of Shuruppak contained the most distilled Anunnaki blood that any humans had ever possessed. The civilization built by the Nam Lugal, over the course of the Fifth World's roughly 240,000-year duration, achieved a sophistication that the tablet describes in terms that have, in the leaked literature, attracted particular attention. The Fifth World's late achievements included, the tablet says, a complete understanding of the principles of astronomical observation. The temples of Eridu and Shuruppak were equipped with instruments for tracking the movements of the planets, the stars, and the slower precessional cycles of the celestial sphere. The Fifth World's astronomers, the tablet says, were aware of the precession of the equinoxes. They had measured it. They knew its period. They knew what part of the great cycle they were currently in. They had also, the tablet says, understood the principle of mathematical abstraction, the development of arithmetic and geometry as systems of reasoning that could be applied to problems beyond the specific cases they had been derived from. They had developed metallurgy. They had developed the wheel. They had developed, in a form that the tablet describes but does not fully explain, methods of communication that allowed messages to be transmitted over great distances without physical messengers. They were, in their late period, a fully developed pre-industrial civilization with capacities that the tablet implies extended into areas we would now associate with much later technological development. The Anunnaki, the tablet says, were satisfied with this civilization. For most of its duration, the Fifth World was, after 4 previous failures, the world that seemed to be working. The Namlugal labored. They built. They worshipped. They paid tribute to the gods who had created them. They obeyed the kings who served as the gods' intermediaries. The cities grew. The empire of the early dynasties spread across what is now the Middle East, the Indus Valley, the Nile Basin, the Central Asian plateaus, and the coastal regions of the Eastern and Western Mediterranean. The civilization, in its mature period, was global in extent. Its trade networks reached every habitable region of the planet. Its language, although fragmented into local dialects in the more remote regions, was fundamentally unified at the level of its writing system, which was the cuneiform script the K4131 tablet was inscribed in. The development that the Anunnaki had not anticipated, the tablet says, came late. It came in the form of the kings themselves. The royal lineage of Shuruppak, in its final generations, had accumulated certain traits from its Anunnaki ancestry that the gods had not fully appreciated. The Anunnaki, in their original creation of the Fifth World, had assumed that the royal lineage would always remain subservient. The kings were partly Anunnaki by blood, yes, but they were still, in their full constitution, primarily Nam Lugal. They would, the gods had assumed, identify with their human subjects, rather than with their distant divine ancestry. They would serve the gods rather than thinking of themselves as comparable to the gods. This assumption was wrong. The last several kings of Shuruppak in particular had begun to think of themselves as something more than human and something less than fully divine. They had begun to identify with their Anunnaki ancestry. They had begun to ask in private councils why they themselves could not act as gods over their subjects, given that they were, in proportion, more Anunnaki than the surrounding population. They had begun to study the histories. The Lulu Amelu memories had not, by the late Fifth World, been fully erased. The royal libraries of Shuruppak contained, in their oldest sections, fragments of accounts that described the previous worlds. The last kings, the tablet says, read these accounts. They understood, from reading them, that the pattern of creation and destruction was real, that they themselves were the latest iteration in a sequence of created races, and that the pattern would continue. They would be destroyed. The cataclysm was coming. It had to be coming, because that was the pattern. The last king of Shuruppak who came to this realization was Ubartutu. He was, the tablet says, the immediate predecessor of the scribe Enma-Duranki, who was either his son or his grandson or some other close relative the tablet does not precisely specify. Ubartutu, in the latter years of his reign, took a decision that the tablet describes as both wise and futile. He could not prevent the cataclysm, The Anunnaki would do what they always did. But he could, he reasoned, ensure that the knowledge of the previous worlds, the cumulative information the Lulu Amalu had originally preserved, and that the royal libraries still partially contained, would not be lost again. He could ensure that the next world, whatever its inhabitants turned out to be, would inherit a complete record, so that they would know, so that they could, perhaps, do something different. Urartutu commissioned, in the final decades of his reign, a series of tablets that would contain the complete history of the previous worlds. The tablets were to be inscribed in the most durable clay available, baked at the highest temperatures the kilns could produce, and stored in locations chosen specifically for their geological stability. The scribes who worked on the project were the most senior in the kingdom. They were given access to every archive in every city of the late Fifth World. They compiled, they cross-referenced, they translated, in some cases, the older inscriptions of the Lulu Amalu that had survived in remote locations, and they integrated these with the later Sumerian records to produce a comprehensive account. The work took, the tablet says, 60 years. It was completed in the reign of Urartutu's successor, who is named on the tablet as Ziusudra, the Sumerian name for the figure who appears in the Akkadian tradition as Atrahasis and in the biblical tradition as Noah. Ziusudra, the tablet says, was both the last king of the Fifth World and the principal preserver of the historical archive that Urartutu had commissioned. He was the one who would attempt, in the final hours, to ensure that the archive survived. The cataclysm that ended the Fifth World is described on the tablet as a compound event. It was not, as the later flood traditions remembered it, simply a great deluge. The Abhalom of the Fourth World had already established that water alone was a sufficient instrument for ending an aquatic civilization. For the Fifth World, which lived on land, the Anunnaki applied a different combination. The tablet calls the cataclysm the Udgug, the day of the storm. But in this specific context, the word storm refers not to weather but to a comprehensive astronomical event. The Anunnaki, the tablet says, used their craft to introduce instabilities into the sun itself. The sun, which had been more or less stable in its output throughout the Fifth World's duration, began, in the final years, to fluctuate. The fluctuations were small at first. Temperatures across the planet began to vary more widely than they had previously. Crops failed. Migrations of animals shifted in unprecedented patterns. The astronomers of Shuruppak, who had been tracking the sun's behavior for generations, noticed the changes immediately and reported them to Urartutu, who was still alive in the earliest years of the disruption. The fluctuations intensified. The sun, the tablet says, began to release pulses of energy at intervals that no natural process could have produced. These pulses, when they reached the Earth, stripped portions of the atmosphere away. The auroras, normally visible only in the polar regions, became visible across the entire planet. The compass needles of the Fifth World, which had been used in navigation for thousands of years, began to fail, because the planet's magnetic field was being disrupted by the solar pulses. Communication systems collapsed. Trade between the cities, which had depended on reliable navigation, broke down. The civilization began to come apart at its edges before the cataclysm proper had even begun. Then the floods came. The disruption of the atmosphere had altered the planet's hydrological cycle. The polar ice caps, which had been stable through the long duration of the Fifth World, began to melt. Volumes of fresh water entered the oceans. The oceans rose. The rains, when they began, were continuous, driven by the disturbed atmospheric circulation. The same patterns that had been used to end the Fourth World were repeating, but now on land. The cities of the Fifth World, most of which were located on coastal plains or in low-lying river valleys, began to flood. The agricultural lands were submerged. The transportation networks broke down. The civilization was being attacked simultaneously from above, by the disrupted sun, and from below, by the rising waters. Ziusudra, in the last days, did what the Anunnaki traditions remember him as doing. He built a vessel. The tablet describes the vessel in technical detail that has not been preserved in the later flood traditions. It was not, the tablet says, a wooden boat in the conventional sense. It was a sealed chamber, constructed of bitumen-coated reeds reinforced with metal frames, designed specifically to survive the combination of floodwaters and solar radiation that the late Fifth World was experiencing. It carried, in its interior, Ziusudra himself, members of his household, certain animals selected for breeding purposes, and the complete archive that Urartutu had commissioned. The vessel was anchored, the tablet says, in the deepest harbor of Shuruppak, ready to be released when the final phase of the cataclysm arrived. The scribe of K 4131, Enma Duranki, was working on his copies of the tablets up until the last possible moment. He was the chief archivist of the project. He had been entrusted, in the final years, with the responsibility of producing duplicate copies of the most important tablets, so that even if Ziusudra's vessel were destroyed, some record might survive in some other form. He had completed, the tablet implies, several dozen such duplicates. He had hidden them in locations he believed would survive the floods. He had finished the last of them, the tablet K, 4131 itself, on the night the cataclysm began. He did not survive. The tablet ends, in its final lines, with what appears to be a statement of his own intention to remain in the temple until the waters reached him. Ziusudra was already aboard the vessel. The vessel was already moving out of the harbor. Enmeduranki, the scribe, had completed his work. He had hidden his last copy. There was nothing left for him to do. And so he sat, in the temple of Shurupak, with his finished tablet stacked beside him, and he waited. The water came. The temple flooded. The scribe was drowned, along with most of the surviving population of Shurupak, and the city itself was scoured by the rising waters and buried, eventually, beneath sediment that would not be excavated for thousands of years. Ziusudra and his household survived. The vessel rode out the cataclysm. When the waters eventually receded, and the sun stabilized, and the magnetic field re-established itself, Ziusudra emerged onto a transformed planet. A great portion of the Fifth World's coastal cities were gone. The agricultural lowlands were ruined. The civilization had been ended, in the sense that its institutional and material structure had collapsed, but its inhabitants were not entirely extinct. Small communities had survived, in the highlands, in remote regions, in places where neither the floods nor the solar disruption had been intense enough to kill them all. Ziusudra and the surviving humans encountered each other. Slowly, over the following decades, they began to rebuild. What Ziusudra carried with him, the tablet says, was the archive. The complete record of the previous worlds. He guarded it. He taught from it. He passed it on, in selected portions, to the leaders of the rebuilding communities. And over the next 2,000 years, as the rebuilding accelerated and as small towns grew into cities, and as the languages and writing systems of the post-Fifth World period developed, the archive was reproduced, was translated, was scattered across the new civilizations that emerged from the survivors of the cataclysm. The Sumerian civilization that would emerge in the lower Mesopotamian plains around 4000 BC inherited, through Ziusudra's descendants, the central portion of this archive. They preserved it in the temple libraries of their own cities, in copies and copies of copies. By the time of Ashurbanipal, in the 7th century BC, the archive had been copied so many times that only the most well-preserved tablets retained any clear connection to the originals. K 4131 was one of those. It had been copied directly from a tablet that Enmeduranki himself had inscribed. It had passed, through unknown intermediaries, into the Royal Library of Nineveh. It had been buried in the ash when the library burned, and it had been recovered in 1851 by Austin Henry Layard and shipped to London and shelved in the basement of the British Museum and forgotten for 63 years before being read. We are the sixth world. We are descended biologically and culturally from the survivors of the fifth. The cataclysm that ended their civilization is the flood that survives in our oldest memories. The kings who ruled them are the antediluvian patriarchs of our scriptures. The cities they built lie buried beneath the alluvial plains of the modern Middle East, awaiting an excavation that, the tablet implies, will eventually reveal what is there. The archive Ziusudra preserved is partially in our possession. The K 4131 tablet is one fragment of it. There are others, the tablet says explicitly, that have not yet been found, or that have been found but have not been recognized for what they are, or that have been recognized and are currently being held in storage facilities that are not accessible to ordinary researchers. The Anunnaki, the tablet says, were aware of Ubartutu's project. They knew that the late kings of Shurupak had been compiling an archive. They did not, however, act to prevent the compilation. The tablet offers several possible explanations for this restraint, and the explanations are layered in a way the translator of 1935 found puzzling. The first explanation is the simplest. The Anunnaki had concluded by the late Fifth World that the suppression of knowledge across worlds had not worked. The Udlalal had inscribed their patterns in stones. The Nagalam had transmitted the patterns through their songs. The Imgirgir had embedded their literature in the atmosphere. The Kuab had taught their successors in the deep. Every effort to keep the previous worlds hidden had failed. The Anunnaki had concluded, the tablet implies, that the attempt to maintain secrecy was no longer worth the effort. If the Fifth World survivors wanted to remember the previous worlds, they could. The Anunnaki would no longer try to stop them. The second explanation is more disturbing. The Anunnaki, the tablet says, were preparing to leave. The end of the Fifth World was, in their planning, the end of their direct involvement with this planet. They had decided, in long councils whose details the tablet preserves only in fragments, that the cycle of creation and destruction had run its course. They would build the Sixth World, the world we now inhabit, and they would step back. They would withdraw. They would not, for an indefinitely long period, intervene directly in the affairs of the new race they were about to create. The archive that Ubartutu was compiling, the Anunnaki seemed to have reasoned, would be transmitted to the New World. The New World's inhabitants, the Sixth World's humans, would inherit it. They would read it, in fragments, over the course of their own civilization. And the Anunnaki, by not preventing this transmission, were essentially handing over the cumulative knowledge of all the previous worlds to their final creation, to do with as it pleased. The third explanation is the one the leaked literature has spent the most time analyzing. The Anunnaki, the tablet says, may have been forced into their restraint by an opposition they had not faced before. The tablet describes, in passages that have been partially translated and that contain references the modern scholarship has not been able to fully interpret, a faction within the Anunnaki themselves that disagreed with the practice of destroying worlds. This faction is associated with the figure who appears in the later Sumerian tradition as Enki, the god of wisdom and of the freshwater Abzu, the deity who, in the surviving flood myths, warns Ziusudra of the coming destruction and instructs him to build the vessel that will preserve him. The K 4131 tablet describes Enki's faction as having argued, in the councils that planned the end of the Fifth World, that this fifth ending should also be the last, that the Sixth World should be built differently, that the new race should not be destroyed when its accumulated knowledge began to threaten the gods' control, that the gods should, instead, withdraw and allow the new race to develop on its own and accept whatever consequences that development might bring. This faction, the tablet implies, prevailed. The end of the Fifth World was undertaken according to the established pattern, but the design of the Sixth World was modified to reflect the new policy. The Sixth World would not be terminated. The Sixth World would inherit the archive, and the gods would, after creating it, step back. The figure of Enki, the tablet says, was the one who actually instructed Ziusudra in the final days. The instruction was, in the surviving Akkadian and biblical traditions, remembered as a warning given through a dream or through a whisper at the wall of a reed hut. K 4131 gives a more direct version. Enki met Ziusudra in person, several times, over the course of years. They had long conversations. Enki gave Ziusudra detailed information about what was coming, when it would come, what he should build, what he should carry on it, what he should do after the cataclysm ended. Enki also gave him, the tablet says, instructions about the archive. The archive was not to be destroyed. The archive was to be preserved, divided, and distributed. Multiple copies were to be made. The copies were to be hidden in different locations. Some were to be carried on the vessel. Others were to be buried in the temples of the cities that would not survive the floods, in the hope that they would be eventually excavated by the descendants of the survivors. Still, others were to be transcribed onto materials more durable than baked clay, although the tablet does not specify what these other materials were. Ziusudra followed the instructions. The archive was divided. The copies were hidden. K 4131, as one of the final duplicates Enmedaranki produced, was among those that were placed in temple repositories, rather than carried on the vessel. The tablet's location in the library of Ashurbanipal, thousands of years later, is consistent with this distribution strategy. It had been buried in Shuruppak at the time of the cataclysm. It had been excavated, at some point during the long Sumerian period, by archaeologists working under royal commission. It had been read, copied, classified, and transmitted forward through the temple library systems, eventually ending up in Nineveh, among the broader collection of antediluvian materials that Ashurbanipal had assembled. Its survival, the tablet implies, was part of the original plan. The plan included, in some sense, the eventual transmission of this specific tablet to the readers who would, in some future world, be ready to understand it. The scribe Enmedaranki, the tablet says, was selected for his role in the compilation because of his particular abilities and his particular bloodline. He was, the tablet implies, a direct descendant of the royal line of Shuruppak, with a higher concentration of the Anunnaki contribution than was typical even for the priestly classes of the late Fifth World. He could read the oldest inscriptions that the Lulu Amelu had originally produced. He could, more importantly, write in the script that the original archive had been kept in, a script that was already, in the late Fifth World, regarded as archaic, and that very few living scribes still understood. He was the natural choice for the compilation project. He knew this. He had been groomed for it from a young age. And he had accepted by the time of the cataclysm that his role would end with him remaining in the temple while Ziusudra escaped. He had been told this from the beginning. He had agreed. His copies of the tablets were his legacy. They would survive him. They would, in time, find their readers. The scribe's name appears, in surviving Mesopotamian literature, as the seventh of the antediluvian kings, the figure to whom various traditions attribute the receipt of divine wisdom from the gods. The reference is, the tablet implies, a memory of the actual historical Enmedaranki, the scribe of K4131, whose role in the compilation project was so central that later traditions remembered him not as a priest or an archivist, but as a king. The conflation is understandable. By the late Fifth World, the distinctions between royal, priestly, and scholarly functions had blurred at the highest levels. Enmedaranki had been all three. He had been, in his final role, the keeper of the archive that contained everything any subsequent civilization would ever know about the worlds that came before. The flood ended. The waters receded. Ziusudra and his household disembarked, the tablet says, on a high plateau in the region that would later be called the Armenian Highlands. They began the slow work of repopulating the surrounding lowlands as the floodwaters retreated. They encountered, in the early years, the small populations of Fifth World survivors who had managed to weather the cataclysm in remote inland regions. They integrated with these populations. They taught. They organized. They eventually moved south into the alluvial plains that would, after centuries, be drained and cultivated and become the foundation for the Sumerian civilization that emerged in the 4th millennium BC. The Sixth World began, slowly, with the survivors of the Fifth living scattered across the recovering planet, with the archive distributed in caches that would, over thousands of years, be partially recovered and partially lost. With the Anunnaki having withdrawn to whatever home they had returned to, no longer monitoring directly, no longer intervening, but not, the tablet implies in its final passages, entirely absent. They were watching, from whatever distance they had retreated to. They had not entirely abandoned the planet. They had simply changed their relationship to it. And they would, the tablet hints in language that the translator of 1935 marked with a particularly heavy underline, return at some point in the future. The tablet does not specify when. The tablet does not specify why. The tablet only says that the withdrawal was not permanent, that the gods who had built and destroyed 5 worlds would eventually come back to inspect the 6th one. And what they would do then, when they returned, the tablet does not say. And so we arrive at the present, at the 6th world, at ourselves. Every reader of the tablet, from George Smith in 1872, to the unnamed translator, who completed the work in 1935, to the junior curator, who began leaking fragments in 1968, to the small circle of independent researchers who have assembled the surviving portions over the past 50 years, has arrived at the same uncomfortable position. We are not the first civilization. We are not even the first attempt. We are the 6th iteration of a project that has been ongoing for a span of time. The tablet measures in units that translate, approximately, to hundreds of thousands of years. And every previous iteration ended in catastrophe. Every previous iteration was destroyed by the same beings who had built it. The pattern is not encouraging. The first world burned. The second world shattered. The third world dispersed. The fourth world drowned. The fifth world endured all of these at once, compressed into a final cataclysm the tablet describes as the cumulative judgment of every prior ending. And then the sixth world began, with survivors, with a partial archive, with a contingent of withdrawing gods who waited for something the tablet does not name. The tablet was an attempt to preserve some portion of that comprehensive understanding. It was a partial attempt. The single tablet that survived, the tablet recovered from Kuyunjik in 1851 and shipped to London and translated piecemeal across the following century, contains only the summary: the 5 worlds, the 5 cataclysms, the 5 vectors of inheritance. The full archive that Ziusudra carried on his vessel through the final flood would have included tens of thousands of additional tablets covering technology, biology, astronomy, history, language, and the specific operating principles of each prior civilization. That archive was distributed in caches across the recovering planet. The majority have not been located. Some, the tablet suggests, were placed in locations the Sixth World civilization cannot reach without rediscovering technologies it has not yet rediscovered. Beneath the deep ocean, beneath the polar ice, beneath the surfaces of structures the Sixth World has interpreted as natural geological features. The fragments that have been recovered have been suppressed. This is the part of the tablet's history that the institutions of the modern world will not discuss openly. The British Museum holds K4131. The British Museum holds it in a non-public collection. The official position is that the tablet is in poor condition and that handling would damage it. The unofficial position, as articulated by the junior curator who began leaking the contents in 1968, is that the tablet's contents are considered too destabilizing to be released into general circulation. The same applies to the dozens of related fragments recovered from other sites across Mesopotamia and Syria and Egypt and the Aegean over the past century and a half. They sit in non-public collections in London and Berlin and Paris and Istanbul and Cairo. The specialists who have examined them have, with rare exceptions, agreed not to publish what they have read. There is no formal secrecy order. There is only a long-standing institutional consensus that this material is not for general consumption, that the public is not prepared for it, that the implications would be socially destabilizing. The implications are these. We are not alone in the history of this planet, and we have never been alone. The structures we cannot explain, the megaliths that exceed our construction capacities, the linguistic correspondences across unconnected civilizations, the flood myths that appear in every culture, from the Andes to the Himalayas to the Pacific Islands, the genetic anomalies that emerge in highland populations descended from the Lulu Amelu, the persistent reports across millennia of beings descending from the sky and ascending from the sea and emerging from the earth and walking among humans before withdrawing again, are not coincidence and are not myth. They are the residual evidence of 5 prior civilizations and the gods who built and destroyed them. Every culture that has produced a creation myth has been remembering, in fragmentary and symbolic form, some portion of the actual history that the tablet preserves more directly. The matter that composes our bodies includes, in trace quantities, atoms that participated in all 5 prior worlds. Some of the carbon in your bones was once part of the Udlalal. Some of the calcium was once part of the Nagalam. Some of the nitrogen you breathe was once inscribed with the literature of the Imgirgir. Some of the water in your cells passed through the gills of the Kuab. And the genetic material you carry contains contributions from each of the prior worlds, accumulated through the hybrid lineages that culminated in the Nam Lugal of the 5th world, and were carried forward by the surviving Lulu Amelu into the 6th. You are not a separate species from the prior worlds. You are their inheritor. You are what remains of them. The cells of your body remember what you do not consciously remember. The intuitions you cannot explain, the recurring dreams that match no experience you have had, the sense of recognition that occasionally overtakes a person standing in front of a megalithic ruin or descending into a deep cave or watching certain configurations of cloud and sky are not random neurological events. They are the genetic memory of your prior selves. They are the prior worlds, recognizing themselves through you. The Anunnaki, the tablet says explicitly, did not withdraw because they had completed their work. They withdrew because the work could not be completed under the conditions they had established. 5 attempts to construct a stable hybrid civilization had failed. The 6th attempt was launched with a different protocol. The 6th world would be left mostly alone. The Anunnaki would observe, from a distance, and they would intervene only if the 6th world either succeeded in stabilizing itself, in which case the larger project could be considered complete, or if it failed in a manner that threatened the broader stellar region within which the Anunnaki operated, in which case they would intervene to terminate the experiment. We do not know which condition we are approaching. The tablet does not say. The compilers of the 5th world did not know. They could only record the protocol and leave the determination to the 6th world itself. We are the determination. Every choice the 6th world makes is the data the watching Anunnaki are recording. They are not benign. They destroyed 5 prior worlds without sentimentality, applying engineered cataclysms calibrated to whatever vulnerability each world's biology exhibited. They are not, in any human sense, our friends. They are the project managers of a long experiment, and we are the current iteration. What we have been given is the archive. The tablet is part of the archive. Every fragment recovered from every Mesopotamian and Egyptian and Aegean site is part of the archive. The myths every culture has preserved are part of the archive. The structures we cannot explain are part of the archive. The genetic memory that surfaces in our intuitions and our dreams is part of the archive. We have been left with the comprehensive record of every prior attempt, encoded into our culture and our matter and our biology, available to anyone willing to assemble the fragments and read what they say. The fragments say this: the cycle has happened 5 times. The 6th time is ours. The withdrawal of direct Anunnaki involvement is both an opportunity and a hazard. The opportunity is that we are not being ruled. We are being permitted to develop on our own terms. The hazard is that we are also not being protected. If we destroy ourselves, no Anunnaki faction will intervene to preserve survivors. The 6th world is on its own, in a way that none of the prior 5 were, and the implications of that solitude have not been fully absorbed by the civilization currently making the choices that will determine the outcome. You are reading this. You are now part of the small circle of people who have access to the contents of the tablet that George Smith partially translated in 1872, and that the unnamed scholar completed in 1935, and that the junior curator began, leaking in 1968. You are now responsible, in a small but real way, for what the 6th world does with this information. What the 6th world does is being recorded. The Anunnaki, the tablet says in its closing passages, did not destroy the 5 prior worlds out of malice. They destroyed them because each world reached a configuration that could not be allowed to persist. The Udlalal became too brilliant and too detached. The Nagalam became too grief-stricken and too immobile. The Imgirgir became too dispersed and too indifferent to the surface. The Kuab became too isolated and too internally generative. The Namlugal Kalama became too fragmented and too factional, with hybrid lineages turning against one another in ways the Anunnaki could not control. Each civilization failed because it reached a configuration that could not be stabilized. The 6th world is being given the opportunity to fail in a new way, or to not fail at all. What the tablet does not say, what the tablet cannot say because the tablet was compiled before the 6th world began, is which it will be. That determination is current. That determination is being made every day by every choice that every member of the 6th world civilization makes. The Anunnaki are watching from wherever they withdrew to. They will not intervene to prevent failure. They will not intervene to ensure success. They will only intervene at the conclusion, whichever conclusion arrives, to either complete the project or terminate it. The tablet ends with a single line in the original Sumerian. The line has been translated by the scholar of 1935 into a phrase that has appeared in every leaked partial transcript since 1968 inches, approximately the same form. The line, rendered as faithfully as the surviving glyphs permit, reads, "The 6th shall complete what the 5 could not, or the 6th shall be the last. There will not be a 7th. The tablet after that line is silent. The remaining surface of K, 4131, is uninscribed. The compilers had nothing further to add. The 5th world had ended. The 6th world was beginning. The archive had been transmitted. The Anunnaki had withdrawn. And the determination of whether the long experiment would succeed or terminate had been placed in the hands of the inheritors who were beginning, in the wet marshlands of Mesopotamia in the 4th millennium BC, to assemble the first cities of the world that we still inhabit. We are those inheritors. We are still in the same world the survivors of the flood founded. The cities we live in are descended from Eridu and Shuruppak. The languages we speak carry, in their grammars and their roots, the residue of the languages the Namlugal Kalama spoke before the cataclysm. The dreams we have at night are partly the genetic memory of beings of fire and stone and wind and deep water who lived and died in worlds we have no other access to. The choices we make are being recorded. And somewhere, the tablet implies in its final unread passages, the Anunnaki are still watching. They have not aged, they have not forgotten, they have not lost interest. They are simply waiting for the 6th world to either succeed or fail, and they have, in the long span of their existence, waited longer than this for outcomes that interested them less. That is what the tablet says, that is what the fragments confirm. That is what the myths and the structures and the genetic memories and the recurring dreams have been telling the 6th world for the entirety of its existence, in forms it has interpreted as religion and folklore and coincidence, and the inexplicable peripheral noise of a civilization that has not yet understood its own origins. We are the 6th, we were preceded by 5. The 5 were destroyed. The history of our planet did not begin in the 4th millennium BC, and it did not begin with the agricultural revolution, and it did not begin with the emergence of anatomically modern humans 200,000 years ago. It began, according to the tablet, in a span of time the compilers measured in units we no longer use, and that the unnamed translator of 1935 declined to convert into modern equivalents because the conversion would have been, in his marginal note, Too disturbing to publish. The tablet sits, still, in its non-public drawer in London. The fragments continue to be examined, quietly, by the specialists who have agreed not to publish. The leaked transcripts circulate among the small communities of researchers who have assembled them. The information is available to anyone who looks for it carefully and reads it slowly and sits with the implications long enough for the implications to settle. We are the sixth world. There were 5 before us. Each one ended, and the watchers, the engineers, the gods who built and destroyed every prior iteration of the project we are continuing have not left. They have only stepped back, to observe, to wait, to determine, when the time arrives for determination, whether what we have built is worth preserving, or whether the experiment has run its course and the planet should be returned to silence in preparation for whatever comes next. The tablet does not tell us how to succeed. The tablet only tells us that succeeding has never been done before, and that the watchers are still watching.